T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Kush's Corner. We have Alex Myers on the show tonight, one of my oldest time friends in the hobby. We grew up in this game together, so I thought there would be no one better to have on for the first episode than Alex. But before that, as always, US ARC, they are the body that is fighting for our rights when it comes to the legislation that the animal rights groups are trying to pass to hinder our industry. So if you're not already, become a member of US ARC, and every membership helps. Every person who is behind the cause helps. Any sort of solidarity we can show just gives us all a better chance at being able to do this consistently and fight the good fight, so to speak. We have a couple sponsors for this episode. First is Gary Scavino with GS Reptiles. For anybody who has been into arboreal snakes, Gary is one of the OGs, one of the best in the business. If anyone's looking for green tree pythons, emerald tree boas, Amazon basin emerald tree boas, carpet pythons, savu pythons, and the list goes on and on, Gary's one of the guys to go to. GS Reptiles on YouTube, one of the best YouTube channels out there for reptiles. So if you, for actual, video of hands-on with animals, I would recommend, going to check out Gary's channel. He always makes some amazing videos. And then we have Blake's Exotic Feeders. For anybody who wants to throw in a little variety into their feeding regimen, get some quail from Blake's Exotic Feeders. High quality quail produced by them. So there's some quality control being used there. Always a good thing to have going on. I am still learning these controls here, so pardon me. But here we are. So episode 1 is here. So basically kind of the gist of this is there's no theme to the show. There's no, per se topic or whatever. I want to talk to people who I find interesting, people who I think have a good perspective in the industry, and conversations that I think are important for people to hear. Before any further ado, though, let's say hi to some people who have showed up early. Tony's in the house. What's going on? We got Brooke is here. Thank you as always. Brandon is in the chat. What's going on? What's up, Joe? If anyone wants to check out a cool podcast, the Colubrid Corruption podcast, I just did an episode with Joe over the weekend. Had a great time. And D-Balls and Exotics, what's going on? Lucas, how's it going, man? Hope you've been doing well. So I guess without further ado, let's get to the episode with Alex Myers.
Good.
You ready for do more in the future? Trap Talk podcasts?
Yes.
Man.
Only Trap Talk. Exclusive.
Yes.
Exclusive. Oh.
So stop calling us.
Rub the spot, get the club to pop. When I come up with the crop, God love it or not. I'm hot from the hop to the rub the spot, get the club to pop. When I come up with the rub the spot, get the club to pop. When I come up with the rub the spot, get the club to pop. When I come up with the rub the spot, get the club to pop. When I come up with everybody, we do it. Everybody, we do it. Do it.
Alex,
Hello there.
what is going on, my friend?
Not much, honestly. Just happy to be honored as the first guest on this podcast, and ready to finish off the day with an awesome conversation about a topic that I hold dear to me, and that is everything and anything in herpeticulture.
Hell yeah. Well, let's do it. Yeah, I mean, honestly, man, I've said this to you before, but when MJ approached me with the idea of doing this show, you were like, I need to have Alex as my first guest. It doesn't make sense to do anything else. So this is, I feel like, very, very appropriate. You're certainly like my oldest friend in the hobby. We have for anyone who doesn't know, let them know the backstory of not only you, but kind of where we met and how our paths have kind of been parallel in this reptile life.
And the Stephen Kush, Alex Myers lore. Okay. So I mean, it goes back to the Wildlife Discovery Center, because we were volunteering there in high school. I think you were working there in high school, though. I was a volunteer, but it was just, that facility, I mean, that was hard to beat with. I mean, the venomous building there was, the Mang Shans, the North American rattlesnakes, the king cobras, the West African green mamba. Gaboons, and then I think he had a desert horn viper too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
the Bushmaster. So, always, surrounded by a bunch of cool, exotic species at our time, younger ages, I should say.
All things considered.
It took off from there, because after the Wildlife Discovery Center, I know you had left to do some stuff, and I was working part-time at the local pet shop. But I remember you had your collection in the city still, and we vending Scott Smith's All Animal Expo in the DuPage County Fairgrounds. That was a time you were breeding a lot of leopard geckos there too.
Yep.
And you had some ball python projects going. But I remember you were raising up a lot of I remember you had the Moluccans, like in the sea serpents juvenile or subadult rack, like they were little, and now they're huge. So it's like crazy to think that goes back. Or I remember, I think it was like a year after you got like your blue beauties too. Your male would fit in my hand, and I'm cleaning him, and it's just cool to see like those snakes going back, and like, man, I remember that when that thing was little. Just to the history, I guess, or at least maybe the sentimental history of those animals. It's cool to see where that goes. And then I don't know. I mean, we've always been in touch with things, sending even something as simple as sending memes on Instagram. Let's be real here. It's what we do. But
important parts of communication as a person our age these days is, if your Instagram meme game is weak, you're gonna fall behind in this world and this day and age. I feel strongly about that one.
Totally valid. Valid.
So growing up, what would you say were like a few moments, in regards to your life with reptiles, or even just like, let's say, science in general, that really kind of you look back on as that was like a catalyst moment, or a handful of catalyst moments of like that this experience has changed my life, changed my perspective. Give us a few examples of that for you.
This one I've said in the past, and I'll say it again because it hits the spot right there, is my first reptile rampage. Remember, Wildlife Discovery Center would host that. And this was before I was a volunteer there, but my parents would take me there all the time when I was a younger kid, just to see the diverse collection. And there was a member there from the Chicago Herpetological Society. They were just letting young kids check out a normal corn snake of theirs. And I remember specifically, because I watched Steve Irwin, Jeff Corwin, Austin Stevens, wild snakes, or snakes in zoos. And I asked what zoo that snake belonged to, and the person said it was their pet. And for whatever reason, 8-year-old me had never even thought of the idea that you could keep a snake for yourself. You could have a pet reptile, like a dog or a cat. It just wasn't the norm back then. And I still have fond memories even into early elementary, I want to say like 5th grade, when I had gotten my first corn snakes. Even then, people would say, "You have pet snakes? That's weird." Now you say you have pet snakes, people are like, "Oh, cool, my cousin has a bearded dragon." Like, reptiles are definitely more part of the norm these days. But even back then in our early years when we were young, it's just it wasn't as accepted. So that moment definitely stands out because I was like, wow, I could own my own reptile, and that began to spiral into reading books. I remember as YouTube started up, Brian Barczyk's video. He had an entire video clickbaited. I remember this vividly, called "Corn Snake Eats a Baby Pig," and it was a zoomed in image of a corn snake eating a fuzzy. And yeah, it was clickbait, but then he actually broke down, here's a basic feeding schedule for a corn snake. So it was cool to start using that as a source. And then I want to say Don Soderbergh's book. He's no longer breeding corn snakes, but he had the complete care and maintenance of corn snakes. I want to say it's part of the AVS line. I could be totally off on that though. But there's a bunch of other books in that series. So I was just reading books. Reptiles magazine, when it was the ReptileChannel.com, had some care sheets and stuff that I could reference. And so I was able to dive into all of these early articles, everything from reticulated pythons to some of the like Argus monitors. There was a guy on there who had wrote an entire care and breeding of Argus monitors. That would have been 2009, 2010. I think that site link is still up on reptilesmagazine.com now. But transitioning from the corn snake moment, the second peak moment for me would have been when I was browsing the reptilechannel.com. And this would have been in 2012. I would have been in 6th grade. I was working on a project in English class. And we had to write what was a hobby that you're passionate about. So I went up to my teacher. I said, Mr. Greenberg, could I please do the hobby of caring for a corn snake? And he said he'd allow it. And by going on to it was just an excuse to go onto the Reptile channel in class. And it was on that day, Scott Corning, who is the godfather of sailfin dragons, if not the founder of sailfin dragons in the United States, let alone the world, his article on the care sheet was published. And that was the first thing I saw when I opened up the website that day. And that's what hooked me onto the crazy, awesome agamid lizards, most notably sailfins and water dragons.
So how old were you again when you ran across that article?
I would have been 12 years old. So this would have been about 2 years before the Wildlife Discovery Center.
Wow. So what would 12-year-old Alex have thought about 15, 16-year-old Alex getting to work with Philippine sailfin dragons at the Wildlife Discovery Center?
Probably would have been just as excited as when I found out. For some reason, I don't remember if you were there on the day, but I remember this was when Adeline Robinson was working there.
Okay.
Maggie Sullum.
Yeah.
And we were soaking some tortoises outside in the little courtyard area. Like when you'd have like Croctoberfest, you'd have like one of the big, Rob would have one of the big pythons stretched out. And for the viewers hearing us, Rob Carmichael was the director of the Wildlife Discovery Center and the curator of that collection. So yeah, he was my former boss. Really awesome guy, very genuine, kind, and sharing. Regardless, though, I remember Adeline had this baby Asian water monitor there, and she was letting it swim amongst the tortoises. And I said, man, that reminds me a lot of a sailfin. And Adeline goes, yeah, we're going to be getting in some in like a month. And I said, what? I couldn't believe. I was so excited. Yes. And that's sure enough, I want to say it ended up being a few months, but we ended up getting that pair of Pustellatus from Ty Park. And I mean, dude, it's, for me, everybody has their dream species. So to be spending every weekend as a volunteer there in the presence of those magnificent lizards, in my opinion, at least, they're just so hard to beat. The fin, the purples. I mean, even if you look at their scales, the chest scales are super thick and armor-like, and then they have keeled dorsum scales, and it's really fine on the belly. And then it's just like, they remind me of like an all-in-one lizard. There's just different parts of them that, you think it was, like how they say kids draw cars or animals, they're so disproportionate, right? Like a car, like when you drew a car as a kid and it had like their crazy long front or like a extremely long pickup truck. That's what I sometimes would imagine a sailfin was like, is somebody didn't know how to put the pieces together. So like, oh, we've got some keel scales here, and here's a giant fin for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, I'm obsessed with them.
Yeah. I mean, well, I think for good reason. and I always like seeing people obsessed with weird off the cuff things. I mean, I'm obsessed with scrub pythons, as many probably know who are watching this.
No way.
Yeah, isn't that weird that I like scrub pythons? So by the time you were having those experiences with the Hydrosaurus at the Discovery Center, like how deep were you into like your research obsession with sailfins?
It was tricky because I hadn't while I had met you at the Discovery Center, I hadn't really branched into the idea of social media. So it wasn't until I was like 16, 17 that I actually made like a Facebook account. And from there, you could start to see the people who were posting photos more often. At the time, the king of the sailfins online, aside from what Scott Corning was doing, because he was not on social media at the time other than his website, was John Steele. So anybody that knows sailfins from a while back, Jay's Arboreals, and he worked really closely with Linda Switzer and Anthony Sains, who are other well-known lizard people. But John really took those sailfin projects under his wing. Okay. And then from there, it was just trying to read and research. Unfortunately, due to leaving the Discovery Center shortly after that period, because I had to start working in order to grow my own personal collection, I started working at the local pet shop and volunteering at Friends of Scales Reptile Rescue. And I really only had one main contact directly for the mentorship with sailfins, and that would have been Ryan Shermell of Boreas Exotics, who's more of a hardcore bassless guy. And he was my very first mentor when it came to the Chinese water dragons, which is what a lot of people know me for. I've been breeding those since 2018. However, he had some sailfins. And so it was a good way, or I shouldn't say a good idea, it was a great idea for me to work with his animals so I knew what to anticipate when I would eventually get my own sailfins. And so it never stopped growing. One of the best things about, I guess, having a mentor in a case like that was I could do my own research, and then I could ask him, have you experienced this? You know, this was written back in 93, here's what we've learned since, and then I can bounce ideas back and forth. And that way too, I'm not questioning anything. I never had to question anything. And then all of that changed years and years later in 2020 when the species were split back. So there used to be 3 species and now there's 5. And that research has only immense, especially as I went through college, having access to a university database. I could download papers all the way from the 1700s just on basic taxonomic descriptions. And from there, I could just link, at the time, there was Istaturus microlophus. It was its own genus, which is now Hydrosaurus microlophus. But then you also had Lacerta celebensis, like the very first description of that, which is the lizard that I'm using as my green screen, which is Hydrosaurus celebensis, described by Peters in 1872. So it's just a way, I guess, not only for the sake of research to know what I'm looking at, but just understand the history of where those animals go. And like I said, you can call it an obsession. Some people just like to say it's an extreme passion, but yeah, I feel like it really helps me understand what I'm looking at with these lizards, and that passion still continues today. So all from that first pair at the Wildlife Discovery Center, and all, I guess technically you could trace it all the way back to seeing that first image, but definitely ramped up. It's one thing to see a photo, but to see what you love in person, handling it, looking at it right in front of you, that's something totally different. I know it's the same way for you with scrubs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think when people start off with an obsession or with pursuit of a species or a genus, when that's kind of the backstory, I feel like those are the instances where it's the most successful. Where the basis of it is purely just love of the animals, fascination, and then and then like, at least I don't want to speak for you, but for myself, it was kind of like I want to tell people about these animals, and neither of us were the first to research our animals or breed them or whatever, but that doesn't mean we can't be the loudest voices on them. One thing that you've definitely done that I have not done quite so much that I'd kind of like to, you take a super scientific approach to your animals. I mean, the amount that you know about the sailfins that are, in the hobby, the first imports, the lineages that exist in the private sector, in the zoo field. How did that like mentality start? Like what was there like a moment that you were like, I want to take a really analytical approach at this, or like, is this just who you are? Because I think it's an interesting thing for people to hear, because I feel like that's not very common these days. So what inspired you to take that super scientific approach to your animals that you're pursuing in captivity?
So to get straight to the point, it actually has to go back to carpet python people.
All right.
So I love when I was there was a period of time where I really liked the sailfins, and then I had my first water dragon, but I was also branching towards carpet pythons. But I loved Morelia, and I still do. I think they're beautiful. Long story short, I eventually got turned off of them because I didn't want to deal with nidovirus and any of the potential issues regarding how the lineages worked. But that's what also I think sort of kicked it off for me, is seeing and reading how hardcore some of those Morelia keepers were on keeping their lines pure. It wasn't about what morph they had, how good it looked. They could have the ugliest snake, but they would sell it for a ton of money because they could trace that line 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 10 generations back, because they knew they had pure McDwelli or pure Spiloidea, or I'll say imbricata is the Centralia? No. Yeah, Southern. So it's, common names are not always my specialty. Regardless, that was sort of a kick to me, thinking in the case of the Philippine sailfin dragon, that species stopped being exported to the United States in 1994. So everything that we got in after that was it. Mm-hmm. And as you can imagine, a lizard like that, which not a lot of people cared about, there's only a handful of people that still produce them every year. I can only name 2 people that bred them last year. So, wow. And that says something, with sailfins being more popular these days thanks to social media, but 2 people in the United States breeding Philippines. That is it.
I didn't know that. That is crazy. I would have expected closer to 10. That's insane.
No, as far as I know, maybe there's somebody who's off the grid, but even the people that I've reached out to who aren't present on social media, they've got nothing but duds. It's really unfortunate. And whether it's a husbandry thing, whether it's a lack of focus thing, I don't know, because personally I haven't bred my own sailfins yet. I'd like to, but I'm just not there. So the idea is that in the case of the pustullatus, let me emphasize here that what I'm about to talk about quickly is the Philippine sailfin dragon, Hydrosaurus pustullatus. So all these sailfins you see at expos that are wild caught, that is not any of the species I'm talking about. There's 5 total species. Huh?
I said they're garbage. No, I'm kidding.
They're cool. I love Microlophus, the Sulawesi giant. They get huge. It's like a cyclura. At least that's what Scott said.
Later on, we'll do a deeper dive into the sailfins, but for now, keep going on what you're saying about the Philippines.
Yeah, and so and not even just the Philippines, but what I mean specifically is the idea of keeping track of lineage. Is there are so many keepers that I've talked to who have sailfins, and I'm not trying to sound entitled or some smart schmuck, if you will, but when I ask them who produced their Philippine, they say person X. It's like, well, who did they get their animals from? They say, I don't know. So how do you know you have pure Philippines? Because unless you're counting the labial scales, which if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to make sure I'm correct here because I have my journal right in front of me, my little cheat sheet.
No misinformation here. We know everything.
Yeah. Hey, this is taken right from the taxonomic description. Yeah. So unless your Philippine sailfin dragon has 14 to 15 femoral pores, and then 9 to 10 infralabials and 11, 12 superlabials, you don't have a freaking Philippine sailfin. And
heard it here, folks.
Yeah. So
Philippines.
So, and I remember being at the Schaumburg Tinley show, not Schaumburg Tinley, the Schaumburg NARBC show. Tinley is just a force of habit. Somebody was trying to walk around saying they had a Philippine, and I realized that was an animal that was a triple hybrid John Steele produced, because it had the labial scale count, which was correct because it was a Weberi Philippine Microlophus tribrid, but the toe scales were off. It was like 41 or 40 on the fourth toe, which Pustellatus, it's 44 if I'm not mistaken. I closed
You're
it
just
now.
sitting
So
there giving me 44 scales on a toe in the middle of a reptile show.
Yeah, I am. You can ask Nick Lillis of Unlimited Exotics. Every time he brings sailfins, I'm counting.
I was there. I saw you do it, but I mean that I feel like that's something that we should be emphasized. Like, you don't care about your animals like you should until you're counting their toes in the middle of a reptile.
I want pure stuff, man. Because Indonesia could just say we're gonna close, and like I bought a Microlophus at Tinley in March and sent it to a good friend of mine, and I was like, look, this is a picture perfect micro, and now thankfully they're set up with a reverse trio. So whenever that thing breeds, I know for sure that I have not only pure Microlophus, but taxonomically descript perfect Microlophus. How many people can do that with anything they have? How many people even know the number of scales on the holotype of a ball python? I don't. I don't. So it's like,
Neither.
Yeah. It's the idea is that the animal is definitely important, but some people need to focus on, I think, appreciating the history and the work that goes into having the best examples of that animal, which these days with the morph craze, I think people forget about that. Look at corn snakes and other colubrids. We've hybridized them. We've outcrossed them. White-sided coming from black rats, and then it shows up in bull snakes suddenly. And we know from the Wildlife Discovery Center that black rat snakes and bull snakes can hybridize, or eastern rat snakes, I should say. So it's just one of those where, in the case of the Philippines, it's really important. And again, I keep using Philippine sailfins as an example, but anything, it's important to just know what you have and where it came from. Green tree python people are like that. That's a tongue twister. And carpet python people are like that. Gray banded king snake people are like that. So why aren't we like that with a bunch of other animals? Is it because they're morphs? Does nobody appreciate localities anymore? Does nobody appreciate animals just because they're cool in their own and we don't have to make them pink or albino or hypermelanist or whatever?
Yeah.
But
yeah, I think a lot of that, it comes down to kind of how that market or that sect of the hobby was started, who started it, and for what reasons. Like you said, with like gray banded king snakes, or with like banded rock rattlesnakes, which are very close to my heart. The people who were starting these trends in the hobby, the first people to collect these animals, to breed them, they were field herpers, they were scientists, they were professors, they were researchers. So, they wanted this pair of gray bands to have come from within a quarter mile of each other along this road. They cruise them at this time of the year. And, you could go through their collections and they'll tell you exactly where that snake came from, or 2 generations ago. Same thing with the rattlesnakes. I'm shout out to Kyle Vargas, Clob King on Instagram. We're going through his snakes. He'll show me some, Palencia locality banded rock rattlesnakes, and he can tell me what the last 4 generations of those snakes, how they evolved, what this parent, like this animal that was collected here on this side of the mountain had this band that had this irregularity. 2 generations later, that irregularity is on a third of the body. To me, there's more fulfillment in that than in I triple codom, and not that there's anything wrong with that. I just personally I find more fulfillment in that, and I think that's exactly what you're kind of talking about with with the sailfin dragons. And for you, I mean, you're going to be one of the people who are going to be screaming the doctrine of the sailfin dragons from the mountaintop. And it's encouraging to me that more kind of different sects of the hobby are popping up with that mentality. You know what I'm saying? Yes.
I'll quote, just because I have this memorized. I was on the phone with Casey Schultz, who's another really awesome sailfin dragon keeper, someone I co-authored in Reptiles magazine with 2.
Yeah.
And the thing that she told me parallels what you just said. There's going to be people who keep sailfins that just don't care. They just want to breed them. And people will eventually know them for that. But there will hopefully be a tiny subsect of sailfin keepers. But for the sake of this podcast, because I doubt everybody listening is a sailfin keeper, scrub pythons, banded rock rattlesnakes, locality colubrids, imported colubrids, like all of your cool Orthriophis, Oreocryptophis, mandarin rats. I don't know the Latin for those. But the idea is that there will be the people who want to just breed those for the sake of breeding them, and then there will be people who do care. And as long as there's people who care, that at least means there is a tiny collection of pure, guaranteed pure animals. And again, I'm not trying to sound elitist by saying that. I'm just trying to explain the point of there will be, there's going to be 2 subsects of keepers, the serious hardcore nerds and the people who just casually like reptiles. And there's nothing wrong with casually liking reptiles. Like, I'm a pretty casual bass player. I'm not in a hardcore rock and roll band. I just play bass guitar. And there's going to be people who keep reptiles like that.
There's a difference between being a serious keeper and talking down to others, and being a serious keeper and encouraging others. And I think anything that we're saying is the latter. Especially, we were coming up in this game as teenagers. Teenagers aren't always looked at with a very serious eye at a reptile show or on an email or so we know what it's like to be dismissed by somebody and not be taken seriously. And that can definitely, that one changes how you view that person. And potentially even how you view the hobby as a whole. I think discussions of advancing husbandry, advancing understanding of the animals are important, but to be done in an encouraging way where you're not talked down to because you don't approach your projects in this way. But here's an example of how you could do it. Like take for Alex's example, like being so particular about the scale counts on your founding stock of your projects, so you can have full pride in the animals that you're sending out, that you're representing them as accurately as you possibly can. I think that can be applied to a lot of what we do, across all the species that are in the hobby. So I definitely I love these conversations, and we'll circle back to sailfin dragons a little bit later to kind of get a little more in depth. But man, one thing that came up pre-podcast where I'm like, oh, this has to be one of the first things we talk about. You just got back from a herping trip in Costa Rica. Tell us all how Costa Rica was and how herping was out there.
That was amazing. There's a main group of lizards that are super common there, but I got a lot of field data on, and that was the basilisk lizards. That's a species I'd like to keep and work with someday. And I got to see all 3 species, Plumifrons, Vittatus, and Basiliscus basiliscus, which is the type species described by Linnaeus in 1758 for all 4 of them. And but I mean, that's the thing is, I knocked those out, but there were so many other amazing reptiles because this was part of a college class that I took before I graduated and finished my bachelor's program. But it was the tropical ecology of Costa Rica, and so I just went to a multitude of biomes. I was up in the cloud forest. I was up in the high montane forest. Literally in a span of 3 days, I went from catching the endemic Abronia monticola, 11,000 feet above sea level at the top of a mountain. My cheeks got sunburnt from UV reflection because the UV index was 13 up there. The air is so thin you can't breathe, but it was just enough air that I could run full sprint after an Abronia basking on a rock. We were catching emerald swifts up there. Again, you're so high up, the sun will literally kill you, and these lizards are just sitting under it. But then it drops down to 38 degrees Fahrenheit at night, even though it's 75 during the day. It was a ridiculous biome. But the point is, you do that for a couple days, and then the next day you're down all the way at sea level chasing basilisks and fertilances. It was just incredible to see the amount of diversity you're talking, especially in the case of Costa Rica, it is the size of the state of West Virginia in the United States. And yet, from a species perspective, that country contains 6%, I believe, of the world's species, or biodiversity, as it's often stated and marketed.
Insane.
So it was incredible. There's something to be said about, and I'm sure you experience this with your rattlesnakes down where you're at, but being in the environment of your animal. I could read every weather report on Sulawesi, Mindanao, the Philippines, or Ambon, Halmahera. Cool, I read it. But when you're there and you feel the heat and humidity, or you feel the cold 8,000 feet above sea level, I stayed in a cabin that was not heated. Like, I literally slept in my jeans and 3 jackets because my room got down to like 38, 39. Yep. It was cold. And unfortunately, I didn't get to see the Talamancan pit viper. I was really hoping to see that. I want to say that's Bothraechis nigrovirus. But it's just to be there, and I'm writing all of this down. But it is hard to be, and I think if more people could go out field herping, even if and I get it, it's expensive to travel around the world, but even if you're just catching garter snakes, look where they're at, look how they're basking. And then you ask yourself, well, why are we doing this in captivity? Not because, it's the way we've always done it. There are a lot of younger keepers our age, unfortunately, too, where they use that as an excuse to justify why their way is the right way. And I'm not saying that old keepers are wrong and new keepers are also wrong. But what I'm saying is that try and find that medium. For example, with basilisks, and I'm just going to use this as an example because one, that's what I took most of my data on, and two, they're a lizard that is unfortunately not always kept in the best conditions. So they are a lizard that many people label as tropical. So I'm going to use a low output UVB bulb or whatever. Okay, the UV indexes these things were basking at over the stream in the middle of the afternoon surpasses any desert bulb you can imagine. It was, you will die, like 8 to 10 peak sun.
Dang.
But they're only sitting out there for a couple hours in the afternoon and they have an instant gradient. But in captivity, we kept them with a bulb that covers the entire tank so they can't escape that UV. And we think, we can't keep them with these high output bulbs because they keep dying. It must be a tropical species. We use less UV. And then the lizards get metabolic bone disease, and there's a whole bunch of other factors. And then you look at a basilisk keeper like Eric Haycraft, who preaches high output mercury vapor bulbs and T5 fluorescence, but he also uses big enclosures that are 8 feet tall. So now the lizard can go literally cook itself and then climb 8 feet down and get completely out of that UV. And his basilisks are arguably some of the best, best. I'm getting my words all tangled here. I need more caffeine. But arguably the best examples of their kind in captivity, because he's taken that aspect from nature, but also translated it over to our current technology. Now, somebody from a Facebook group might say, well, mercury vapor bulbs suck as a UVB source. Well, evidently not. Maybe they just suck for the species you're keeping. Sure. And that's where, again, you need to bridge that fine line of, don't diss everything, because chances are whatever is out there currently will work for something. You just have to find it. And that's how I've tried to fine tune my keeping. I know when we've talked on the phone, that's how you fine tune your keeping, because at the end of the day, we can't mimic nature in a freaking box. But if we go out in nature and we try and find those aspects, maybe we can keep making those baby steps forward to slowly better our care versus trying to run before we can walk, coming to a conclusion, claiming we're right, and then just getting involved in a bunch of toxic drama, which you see online all the time, unfortunately. Everybody always says, I'm an advanced keeper and we need to have this conversation about ethical keeping. And then they get burnt out of the hobby because they realize they were so up on their high horse. I think the only reason we, as younger keepers, relatively speaking, have been doing this for 10 years plus is because we didn't jump to conclusions. We keep tweaking, and we're going to keep tweaking our husbandry until eventually maybe we can be up in the big leagues like the people we look up to in the hobby. You have no idea how much it would make me happy to say I can get to a point where I breed all 5 species of sailfins like Scott Corning. I haven't done it yet. I haven't even bred sailfins yet, but I'm definitely a lot closer than I was even 5 years ago. And I'll tell you, the only reason I'm closer is because I didn't say I read one care sheet and suddenly I'm a fucking expert. So you want to ask about field herping in Costa Rica, even though I totally just went off tangent. It was amazing. Lots of cool species. And I hope it encourages more people, at least from what I've said just now, to go out into the field, even if it's a species you never plan on keeping. I was looking at eyelash vipers. I personally have no interest in hots, but seeing the microclimates they were using, I can share that with people who keep arboreals. And maybe it'll help them, maybe it won't, but you know what? At least it's information that's out there. And sometimes that's the best you can do, is just put information out there because somebody will want to use it eventually.
Yeah, I mean, very well said. You know, yeah, I remember when you sent me the pictures of those eyelash vipers. That was a special moment. When you were out there, how many total species did you document throughout your trip?
Too many. I want to say I got over 20. It was different gecko. Yeah, I mean, lots of geckos. Green iguanas were everywhere. It's, you know, where they're actually native. The black iguana. I didn't get the other Tenosaura, which is Tenosaura kinsicarnata. I was not in that range, but lots of the cool obscure colubrids. Emontoides kenkoa, which is just, I want to say, the slender cat-eyed snake. It's an anole specialist. It was actually really cool because I got to see him hunting for sleeping anoles. They do this thing where they find the anole because they've got these big eyes and they can see it in the dark. They find the anole sleeping on a thin twig, and anoles sleep on those twigs. So if a snake starts to crawl on it, they just jump off. So what they do is they triangulate it, and then they use their core muscle to sneak down, and then they go all the way around, and then they grab them off the end.
Wow.
It's pretty sweet. But then you've got some of the snail-eating snakes down there. I got to see Dispus articulata, which is like a black and white banded snail eater. I don't know the common name for that one. And then there was also Cebon nebulata, I believe, or nebulosis. I'm blanking on the species name there. That's the clouded snail eater. Just, again, super cool snakes, just living in the wild, doing their thing. The herpetologist I was with, we actually ran into a bromeliad lizard, Anidia ocellata, and that was a animal that he hadn't seen in 10 years because it's a canopy species.
That's cool.
And I felt kind of awkward because I almost stepped on it. And we were freaking out because it was a rare lizard. But I'm trying to think some of the other highlights for me. Common boa constrictor, Boa imperator.
Hey.
There's just a juvenile there. It was caught right by the bathroom. Probably had just eaten a rat. That was awesome. And then I didn't key it out till later. So I brought a snake hook with me. I had permission from the herpetologist to use it just for moving snakes because Costa Rica is very specific about their wildlife laws, but I had permission from this individual. And I ended up being a juvenile. I can't remember the species name, but it's part of the genus Oxyrophis, the Halloween snakes. When I picked it up, I couldn't ID it from the coral snakes there because the coral snakes don't follow our U.S. rules. And it had just a wide enough head that I couldn't be sure if it was colubrid or an elapid, so I just picked it up with the hook. But it was a juvenile Oxyrophis, and man, just super cool to see them. All sorts of cool frogs. I saw red-eyed tree frog tadpoles in development. The gliding frogs. Can't remember the scientific name. I'm not as well versed in my amphibians, unfortunately, but I did see both of the main dart frogs on the Pacific side. Or not Pacific, the Caribbean side, which was the strawberry blue jeans, Ufaga pomilio, and then Dendrobates auratus, which is the standard green and black.
Yeah,
so super cool to see those. And they were living like in the same habitat. So I couldn't help but chuckle because, again, sort of a lot of dart frog keepers hate the idea of mixing species. I actually have a photo on my phone of a tree trunk, and there's a auratus on the ground and a pomilio about 18 inches up on a leaf next to it. So they're like, you should never mix dart frog species, and there they are existing in the wild.
Do they naturally hybridize? Do you know?
No, different genuses. That's the beautiful thing about a lot of those frogs too, is they call. So the way that they call to each other, I'd imagine, again, I'm not an amphibian expert here by any means, but kind of like how there are different birds that look similar, but the only way to distinguish them is by call, kind of like an eastern or a western meadowlark. I'd imagine that's how the frogs communicate. Oh, you sound like this. You're clearly the same member of my species. Yeah. Let's get it on. But That
I mean,
again, there's
do like a mixed species exhibit like that with different dart frogs that coexist. That's really cool. I didn't know that.
a lot of zoos do that actually.
Yeah.
Again, the hobbyists hate it, but now that I've been to where those things actually live, it's like, well, if you give them enough space, I don't see why not. I'll reference Eric Haycraft again. He mixes a ton of species. He's got Costa Rican, the Coleonyx geckos living at the base of his smooth-headed iguana enclosures. Corytophanes cristatus, which is another Costa Rican lizard. I sadly didn't get to see one of those while I was there, but they share the exact same habitat with red-eyed tree frogs. And guess what? Eric also keeps those in the same enclosure. He's been doing it for years now. Just give them space and provide the microclimates they use. I am totally going to get canceled for saying this. I'm just waiting for some Facebook expert to start commenting.
I'd find that ridiculous if these things are coexisting like that in the wild. That's all the evidence you need. You know, a picture of two different species 18 inches apart on a tree. That's
yeah, like right at the base. I was like, wow, that's Aratus and that's Camellia.
Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. So how long were you down there for in total?
It was 21 days.
Damn. And were you out in the field the whole 21 days?
Yes, sir.
How many showers did you take in 21 days?
Oof. I want to say like 18. When I was up in the Highlands, there was no running water up in the Highlands.
Sure. Okay. So but
I just wore
you were
the
living like a mountain man for 3 weeks straight.
Thankfully not. Yeah, the way it was organized, because this was a class trip, we would drive throughout the day. So we had like a home base where we'd stay at for 2 days, but then we'd drive an hour out to different locations. And it was awesome. That honestly, coolest New Year's of my life was spending New Year's Eve up in the Talamanca Mountains and spending New Year's Day on the Pacific Ocean watching the sunset.
Yeah, that sounds pretty incredible. It's nothing that you can experience keeping snakes in tubs or cages in your house. That's ridiculous.
And that's still fun, but again, more and more people would realize just the beauty that is experiencing nature. You know, I love birds too. I was driving to work this morning. Bald eagle flew right over my car.
Wow.
I think that's cool.
Yeah, that's pretty damn cool.
Yeah, and you can't keep a bald eagle, so.
Well.
But that's what I'm saying. You know, there's so much more to going out and looking for these animals in the field. I'm honestly hoping this summer I can go field herping more. There's a spot by me that's got bull snakes, and
very cool.
A friend of mine knows a location for some Massasauga rattlers, so I'm hoping to go out and check them out. Yeah, the Eastern Massasauga. So that's just, you know, anything I can learn from that. But yeah, I'll never keep rattlesnakes. Sure as hell won't be keeping Massasaugas for obvious reasons. But if I can see the habitat they're living in, maybe I'll learn something from it. And if I ever keep something that comes from a similar habitat, I'll be like, oh, here's another squamate that's using a similar environment. What can I translate over into my keeping? Maybe I'll be a little bit successful.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that, you know, I feel like the hobby thinks of a bunch of these different species as these very separate things, you know, treat them all a separate way. There's so much to be learned from crossing over practices from one area to another. You know, I'm a big proponent of that. You know, for me, I've been able to work with many different species, so I've been very fortunate in that matter, to where I can learn this from one area, that from another area, yada yada, and kind of you know, mix and match different practices. Some things may work, some things may not. Do you have anything that you've experienced in the field that you've taken home and used for any of your animals?
Honestly, as far as, I wouldn't say I've gotten to that point, because I won't lie, I haven't field herped a ton.
Sure. Or
I'd like to say I could have.
A paradigm shift that happened that you are going to use in the future.
Biggest thing would be learning from those basilisks. Everybody who was serious about keeping water dragons, hydrosaurus, and in the case that I observed with basilisks, was that idea of high UVB. I have been ridiculed by many for keeping water dragons with 10.0 lights, as they say. It's a tropical species, use a 5.0. I've always done that. And then to see that translated to an obvious example of convergent evolution, doing what they've been doing for millions of years, just observing them for a few days with all three species. It's like, yeah, I'm going to keep sticking with high output UVB for lizards that clearly use it in nature. And then I'm clearly seeing them use it in captivity, but once again, I provide big gradients. That would definitely be one thing. The other thing, honestly, that I've been trying to do is just shift towards more live plants. You don't realize how humid it is until you are there. At this point, I hardly even use like little humidity gauges to tell me how humid the cages are, because what I thought was ideal at 80%, you feel 80-85% in the jungle. It is totally different. So what I've tried to do is just start aiming by feel.
Sure. Yeah.
And
that's a goal right there, you know, to be able to do stuff by feel with your animals. That's a true understanding of, like, I mean, you know, for me, I guess not to veer too far off, but, you know, around where I live, herping to find blacktail rattlesnakes, banded rock rattlesnakes, you know, one of the ways that we check what the progress is, take the hand on rock that's in the sun, see where it's at. Is it cold still because the sun's still coming up? Is it too hot now because the sun's direct and it's had a few hours of exposure on that rock? You know, little things like that. And that's actually, it's cool that you said that, because that's, once you can do stuff by feel, I feel like that's when you know you have a deeper understanding of what you're doing. But anyway, can continue your point. I digress.
I guess the point is, though, is then the idea of repetition with that. The only reason I know that high UV output bulbs work for the lizards I keep is because I've had success with it over and over and over again. And then to see it in the wild across different species of the same genus doing the exact same thing. Again, I'm not going to come to a conclusion, because at the end of the day, I'm not the one publishing a paper on the captive basking habits of Physognathus. None of that. But I have a rough idea that, okay, they're using it in captivity. I'm seeing them using it in the water. Or
that
in
right
the
there.
in the wild.
Mike's monitors.
Yes,
Listen to him.
Mike.
Listen to the man.
Thank you, Uncle Mike. Yes. I'll never forget when I visited his place too. He put his hand on a rock and was like, yeah, it's hot enough. And then shortly after, we saw his pair of gill and I mating under that hot spot.
Yeah.
So
that's,
like I said, sometimes you just
that
gotta do it
expertise
by
right
feel.
there. If you've been
But,
doing it as Uncle Mike, you can do the hand test and it's successful. And there's proof behind that pudding.
Yeah, bred gill and I with it. So that's what I have to say about field herping. Go out, experience it, and take in everything, and then think about everything afterwards. Because if you're trying to think while you're out enjoying it, then you're not going to enjoy it. That's why I always have a journal on me. I just take a ton of notes.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfect right there. And I kind of, we found ourselves at a good natural transition. You talking about how you use the T10 bulbs with your lizards when most people would recommend a T5. Where did that come from? Where did that piece of information come from that you, through your personal experience, had to your, at least, you know, to your knowledge and then your experience, pretty much disproven? Like, where did that idea come from?
I think a lot of people are about to have like a mind bomb. I was
That's
told to.
Episode 1. Let's do it.
I was told about the idea of using a 10% bulb by people who had been keeping and breeding the species longer than I had, and who were consistent about it.
Oh my God. You don't say.
Yeah. Ryan Shermell and Scott Corning. ZooMed Reptisun T5 10.0.
So then where did the 5.0 recommendation come from? Was that more or less like a marketing thing, or just kind of folklore that passed down just from idiot to idiot, so to speak? Or
I mean, I wouldn't say idiot to idiot, because reality is some people just might not know. I'd be willing to argue that it was more so a case of one-time success.
Okay.
So most notably, there is a old school website on water dragon care. Later found out the person that wrote that website kept 2 dragons and never bred them, but there is information on breeding water dragons there, all of which contradicts my own experience and the experience of other people who's bred water dragons. So it's one of those where, unfortunately, if say I'm a new keeper and I don't have the contacts or the ability to network with experienced individuals, I'm going to Google how to care for an Asian water dragon. That's the first thing that pops up.
Yep.
And it's definitely a difficult thing to guess, because how do you politely tell somebody that, hey, look, maybe this worked for you once, but were you able to be consistent about it? If somebody produces water dragons once from one pair, and what I'm going to say goes off of a fantastic, rant that I've heard Philip Leitz of Arids Only say about the idea of sample bias. So if I have a pair of water dragons, a pair of scrub pythons, a pair of whatever, I know a lot about that pair.
Yeah.
If I'm raising, say, a couple groups of water dragons, 3, 4, 5, and then a bunch of babies, I am totally expanding the number of animals I'm getting to learn from. So when I'm reading this website from somebody who's never bred water dragons on how to breed water dragons, or I'm on the phone with somebody who's been breeding water dragons for the past 10 years and has done it every year for the past 10 years and is having animals living into their double digits that are still breeding, who do you choose? Let me make that a more modern example, actually. This is going to really piss some people off.
Let's do it.
I am a YouTuber with millions upon millions of followers with one water dragon. And I make a care guide and a breeding guide, and everybody follows it like religion. Or I'm the one nerd with 2,000 followers on Instagram that's written a Reptiles magazine article and has taken advice from people that have been breeding water dragons longer than I have, and I've bred water dragons for the past 6 years. Who is seen as correct in the eyes of the majority?
Well, clearly the person with more followers knows more. Was that the right answer?
I rest my case. So that's the thing, is that and I'm guilty of this. I'm not trying to make me sound like an expert here, because I'm still learning, right? 10 years of keeping water dragons and I'm still trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
That's why I haven't written a book yet. I wrote one article which says things will probably change. And I wish more people of our age would realize that it's okay to not know. But it's not okay
not knowing.
It's not okay to claim that you know right away. What do I know right now? I know that for the past 6 years, if I incubate water dragons between 82 and 85, hatches eggs. And if I incubate right at 83, it hatches the biggest, healthiest babies. What do you know? Ryan Shermell has said, 82, 83, typically best temps for babies. Scott Corning, 82, 83 is what I did back in the 90s. Process of elimination. Everything that I just said goes back 30 years. Everybody says 82, 83. It's just sad because some people, I'm going to tie this back to our first point, don't want to trace that history. They want to go to the first thing on YouTube.
Yeah.
Which isn't a bad thing for content creators, because at the end of the day, many content creators want to be the first result because they want to educate people. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to teach people. But there's a difference between teaching and wanting to be the best at teaching. For those watching, I majored in wildlife education. So I literally had to student teach. I've taught labs. I've lectured to college students. And the one thing that I learned when it came to being a good educator is that I am not the best. But if you surround yourself with people who are also good at what they do, then collectively you share quality information. I will never, ever, ever be the greatest water dragon guy of all time. I'm not. I am just a nerd that loves Chinese water dragons. But if I learn with other awesome nerds who love water dragons, then this collective nerdom, if that's a word, I just made that up. It can share. We can share that with other people who also love water dragons, and then we grow the nerdom base. Somebody like write that down. Nerdum, Alex Myers, February 28th, 2024. Anyways, apply that to anything. Scrub pythons, right? You've got some people you know that work with scrubs, and I bet you talk with them quite frequently, right?
Most certainly.
And you're comparing things you do because everybody's going to do things a bit different. And if you want to transition, doing things differently is not necessarily bad. Ooh, the light's out. That was sort of creepy in the back.
8 o'clock mountain time.
So yeah, that's all I've honestly got to say is don't believe everything you hear, but if you talk with people who are doing what you want to do, you will find commonalities and use those commonalities to your advantage in anything you keep.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think there's 2 points I'd like to make based on what you said. One is back to like your thought about the content creators. I think though it's kind of the responsibility of those content creators to kind of maybe not highlight the past, but acknowledge the past. You know, there's nothing wrong with not being the person who discovered A, B, or C. Like, you know, I don't see why one would feel the need to like want to monopolize information or an animal or whatever. So I guess, and you know, we're in this in you know the same kind of boat. We don't maybe have quite the listener base or follower base that some of these people do, but you know, I think, and we'll get into this more, but I think in the hobby these days there's a trend a little too far in the direction of let's forget the past, and I think that's very detrimental to our future. So as best we can be to you know, acknowledge our predecessors, I think, you know, and information will always evolve. I mean, this is science at the end of the day. Science is not fact. It's the pursuit of what's most true at the moment. If we can have that mentality of, you know, they were at point A, point B, we jumped in at point C, we're trying to get it to the next level, but we wouldn't be where we are if the last 100 years, 200 years, 300 years of research hadn't you know, that groundwork hadn't been laid for us. So that's, I guess, a little tangent that, you know, you comment on if you'd like. I guess, yeah, comment on that because I forgot my second point. I'll get it back by the time you're done talking.
Yeah, well, exactly what you just said. We need to remember where we came from. I referenced my mentors and people who I feel are successful with the species I like, even though I was just giving a tangent about water dragons and what people may perceive as correct information. Everybody learned that from somebody. And I guarantee you, if I were to ask Ryan Shermell, where'd you learn your water dragon stuff? He would have somebody, and that somebody would have somebody, and it would just keep going back. And it would be a little bit different each time it goes back. And those are the advancements you just spoke about. So, like I said earlier, sometimes you just got to walk and not run. And it seems these days through content creation, everybody wants to be the one doing something.
Yeah.
And I think maybe they should take back and realize that it's okay to just take it at a steady pace, because as long as you stay on pace, you'll eventually get where you want to. If you would have told me with one pet water dragon 10 years ago that I'd be breeding these things 5 years after I got it,
Yep.
you know, it's like, I would have said, John, you're joking, but that passion grew. I networked and I did it. I didn't do it overnight. I didn't just go out the next week and buy a male water dragon. No, I researched, I listened, I spent time. And then I produced 3 fertile clutches the first year I attempted to breed water dragons.
Not half bad.
I couldn't have done that if I had rushed in a week, right?
No.
And I wish more people could appreciate that. You know, we all have a common end goal with our desires. Even if you're somebody that wants to breed ball pythons, you just think they're cool, because a lot of people do.
And they are.
Yep. Yeah, they are. They're beautiful snakes with all the different polymorphic traits you can work with now. So, and not just polymorphic, but genetic traits as well. So the idea is that I don't know, something as simple as like a pastel and a lesser. Cool. Make that pastel lesser. Raise up your snakes for 3 years. Take the best goddamn care of them that you can. Learn. You'll get there. You don't have to do it in a week or in a single year.
No.
Take your time at it. And everybody who I've sought advice from has just always repeated that. Take your time. And unfortunately, I think it's just through, again, the idea of these content creators, the idea of social media, for better or for worse, we all seek instant gratification. But I feel like instant gratification is just an endless, it's like a hole that's never filled. You know, you get what you want, and then you want to get another thing and another thing. But, you know, if you go back to something you slowly built up to, you will remember that forever. I came home from Friends of Scales October 16th, 2018, and I looked inside my water dragon enclosure, and there was a baby. They hatched naturally in the enclosure, the first clutch. I'm never going to forget that because it took me 5 years to get to that point.
Yeah.
How many people can remember their first animal they bred to the day?
I can't.
Maybe I'm also just hyper analytical. But the point is that I care about that, and I wish more people would care.
Yeah. And you know, I think in a day and age where the new keeper, the new person who's interested in the hobby, the introduction is, you know, professional breeding, full-time, this or that, full-time breeding, influencing these days. You know, what Alex just described, I personally think is the way of the future. You know, experiences like that, the amount of kind of precision being used to pursue your project, you know, I feel like those are going to be the people who are the most successful in the long run. You know, I think in terms of whatever you're working with, it's not about being the know-it-all, the best at whatever. I think in this day and age, it's going to be about being the loudest voice and about bringing the most attention to what you're doing. And that also doesn't mean only emphasizing yourself, because I'm a firm believer in high tides raise all ships. So if, you know, and like, you know, Alex is pointing to his mentors and, you know, the people who are doing it with him, who in other fields, people might see those peers as competition. And I think rather than those being competition, that's your tribe of people. That's the group that you're with forward. I think, you know, working together will accomplish a lot more than trying to do it as an individual and have a power struggle involved. So I guess another little tangent, but I think it kind of all ties into what we're talking about. But I think kind of a good natural segue with with how social media has now really become the center of our industry, where when we were young, first learning about this, it was mostly Reptiles magazine and going to your local show or whatnot. The early YouTube channels like Snake Bites TV. You know, now that we're so, like, the amount of information is greater than it's ever been before. What are your thoughts today on new keepers or people who are now just coming into the hobby? How should one kind of go about operating and learning, given that you can go so many directions compared to where we were when we were first getting involved with this?
First and foremost, have an open mind. I honestly think that's the only reason I've been able to network and talk with as many people as I have. Many of the, I'm not trying to sound terrible here, but content creators have fans, right, that get into reptiles by following them.
Sure.
So what happens is these fans then only keep the reptiles these creators have, and they only keep them the way these creators do. And that's all they focus on. And then let's say like a challenging uncommon species. Say a I don't know, like a Madagascar hog nose snake, right? Leaheterodon.
Yeah.
Say you've got a creator that sets one of those up in a big setup. They're going to be breeding them. And then the fan was to buy this snake. They do the exact same thing, but they failed to do a lot of research because they only followed this one channel. And they don't realize that snake is wild caught. Snake dies. How did this happen? I did everything this one person said. Well, if you had, used the internet, right? Use the internet. Google Scholar, natural history of Malagasy hognose snakes. Oh, here's another person that's worked with them. Here's how they keep them. Just branch out like the Angry Orchard ad, right?
The Angry Orchard ad?
Yeah, branch out. That's what they say for their hard cider.
We're sponsored by Angry.
Yeah, but you see what I mean is that
Yeah.
when you highlight the commonalities, don't be closed-minded. Talk to everybody. And when you do that, you'll also find that you don't disagree with people. And when you don't disagree with people, people don't hate each other. There's so much toxicity online. My way is the right way. My way or the highway. You're wrong. I'm right. And it is just a waste of time. What good is good information if it can't be shared for the good of others? I've said that in the past. I quoting my mentor Ryan on that. Like, why do we fight like kids over becoming successful adults when if we work together, we could just be there sooner? It's so simple and it's so easy to just not be an asshole. Straight to the point there.
Yeah.
And Dennis McNamara, really awesome keeper. He is they've got Philippine sailfins at the zoo too. I talked with him at the past couple Tinleys. But yeah, learn from your mistakes. If I'm a new keeper and I'm like, oh, I don't like the way this old school keeper keeps his snakes, it disgusts me. Well, maybe that old school keeper said, don't feed quail chicks to this lizard because it's a fish specialist. And I'm not still going to listen to him. He's full of crap. And so I'm going to feed quail to mine, and then their lizard dies. How did this happen? Nobody told me this would happen. Somebody just did. You just didn't believe him because you were upset because he did something slightly different than you. You don't have to like what everybody does.
No.
You just have to be a decent, open-minded person. Emphasis on being decent and open-minded.
Yeah.
And as Dennis just said, learn from your mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of on that topic of all the toxicity and whatnot that the internet has given basically a platform for, one trend that I think is very good-hearted in nature, but has gone bad, and it can definitely be saved. But I think is one that makes for an interesting discussion is the idea of a bioactive habitat. We've had plenty of conversations about this topic, and I think it's addressed in a very binary kind of way where it's all or nothing, or my way or the highway. Doesn't take into consideration the background of the animal, yada yada yada. So I guess do your thing, and we'll see where this takes us. What are your thoughts on this new trend that we're seeing and some of the negatives that have come from it?
Alex, I'll take this from the perspective of my friend Bill Stewart. I was talking with him on this. He said, so bioactive being a buzzword these days, but more importantly, what I have noticed, and again, this is just my personal observation, so it's really not that special in the long run. People seem to be using bioactive as a term for best welfare of a captive animal.
Sure.
So for example, I'll tie this to you. You use paper and ReptiChip for your scrub pythons. There are some people that would cry like, young kids because they don't like that.
Right.
So they set their scrub python up in a bioactive setup. Their scrub python's wild caught. Scrub python has worms, so when it poops, you would see that on paper and in shit most likely. Bioactive setup cleans up the worms. Snake dies months later. Same thing I just said earlier. How did this happen? I had welfare to the point. But I'll also argue that there's nothing wrong if you've got one scrub python, you want to deck it out in a big vision cage with live plants. Like, that's awesome. I'm pretty sure, isn't Ari have that at his zoo and Ryu? They've got like a big, I haven't been there yet. I want to go. So the point is that you have to, if you want to do that, you have to get to there. Like, I have a ton of customers that buy water dragons from me that set their lizards up in big bioactive setups. I personally don't do that because this may sound gross to people. I like to check the feces of my lizards. I don't have filters. I change water every day. It is a labor of love, but every morning when I look in that tub, I can see, oh, healthy turd, healthy urate. They're good. Or last year, where I had really low breeding success, I saw abnormal urates and some odd stringy bicks. Took a lizard to the vet. Yep, chronic salpingitis, just reproductive issue of an older animal. Had I had a naturalistic filtered setup, I would have lost that animal. Would have never known why. So, but then there's also that argument that I'm doing this to breed them. And I love breeding Chinese water dragons. So the value of my animals to me as a breeder is different than the value of somebody keeping an animal as a pet. As awful as this sounds, if a pet water dragon dies, it's not as much as a loss as it is to a breeder who knows the exact lineage of their water dragons and realize that this might be the last of this wild caught bloodline.
Sure.
And that's why that breeder, i.e. me in this case, would choose to keep that animal with a little bit more of a simple water setup. But at the end of the day, the water dragon that my customer has in a big, beautiful setup, a guy has one setup in a tattoo shop, big display. It looks awesome.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Right? Like, rock on.
Yeah.
That lizard's doing great. And you look at my lizards, kept a little bit more simple, 10 years old, still breeding, looks identical physically. That lizard's doing great. So I don't think bioactive is a bad thing. If anything, it just makes it easier and more fun. It's cool to like create your own mini ecosystem. I think Josh Halter even has it to where you can add like fungus to like add microbes to the soil. So it even like it forms that symbiotic relationship with like your plant roots. That's awesome. But to get there, there are still necessary steps of simplicity to make sure that you can have that animal in a nice bioactive setup for the long run. Does that sort of make sense? Maybe, or maybe I'm just spewing nonsense.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of the perspective that's necessary, because I think at the end of the day, if you have to say what's better, a bioactive enclosure with live plants and yada yada, or paper in a plastic hide, based on that binary in a very simple way, simple presentation, probably the bioactive. But like you said, there's steps to achieve that ideal setup. And I think that's kind of overlooked in many ways. Because you can show your bioactive on a YouTube video and be all high and mighty with your chest puffed out, but then be missing some very, very key information as to why your animal can't even do well in that setup to begin with. And I personally have yet to see any sort of evidence that would tell me that animals are healthier or more enriched or whatever with the same care parameters, with just that one difference. Because if you're obviously, in the case of like a water dragon, if you have that thing in like an adult water dragon in a 40-gallon tank with paper, a shitty, like if you're keeping it like garbage, it's going to be terrible. But why would you ever want to set up an animal like that to begin with? But if you take an appropriate size enclosure, non-bioactive substrate, fake plants or whatever, I personally, I'm not convinced yet that one way or another the animal has a different experience. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's those sort of tying back to what we discussed with field herping. It's those aspects in nature right? These basilisks that I observed sitting on a branch. Okay, I cut 2x4s and make shelves. It does the same thing functionally. The lizard still has to work its muscles to climb up onto the 2x4. The only difference is one looks nicer in nature and the other one is for ease of cleaning. But the lizard still gets the same benefit out of it. Now, if you want to do a naturalistic setup, and let me get something clear, naturalistic and bioactive are two totally different things, because a bioactive setup just means that it's self-cleaning. A lot of my setups are, I guess, functionally naturalistic. Like I throw live plants in there just for the sake of humidity, but I still have ReptiChip on the soil. I just have the plants hanging in pots and whatnot, or bromeliads growing off the bark. So my setups aren't bioactive, but the water dragons still encounter the same aspects they would in nature. Say, I've got cinder blocks at the base of my cages in the salalefins, because the salalefins live near water. Like this is a photo of a Salalefins on Sulawesi on a giant rock overlooking a stream in Raw Pendang. And I only know that because I stole this from iNaturalist. So all credit to the iNaturalist user.
You were there and took the picture.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll be there next year.
Right.
But the point is that, okay, I don't have a giant boulder in my salalefin cages, but I've got cinder blocks that they can sit on, pancake out right on the edge of their water bowls. And then they can go up and even get flatter and cook themselves on a shelf, right? Just a black PVC shelf. Not a rock, but it mimics that same aspect. And therefore, I would like to think, and this is where it gets controversial on people's opinions, I am providing the same level of welfare through them basking, heating up, regulating their UV exposure that they would do in nature. I'm just providing that on a PVC shelf and a zoom ed light versus the sun and a giant volcanic boulder in a stream. Some people are going to argue that it should only be a volcanic boulder in a stream. And other people will be like, yeah, it's the same aspect. You're just doing it in captivity. I'm not going to say which way is right or wrong, because I don't really see any difference. If you like doing it one way, awesome. At the end of the day, the lizard's going to hopefully live 20 plus years.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, there's certain metrics that can be used, longevity of that animal, how long that animal is fully functional. Does it maintain its vision, or does it have, in the case of like a lizard like that, does it have its fingers and its toes? Does it breed? Has it reproduced multiple times? And I think that can be achieved in either setting. We've lost Mr. Alex. While it can be achieved in either setting, I think that still needs to be the baseline. Is how can we measure how well this animal has done compared to, okay, how much can we feel good about ourselves for the enclosure we set it up in? Let's see what's going on with Alex. Technical difficulties on our first episode. Very fun. But hey, I mean, we made it. We made it almost an hour and a half without much of a slip up. So, and that, yeah, I mean, thank you, Mike, for that comment. That's I've done the same thing actually with my my Mangshan vipers. I just, I used some logs that were around the property to furnish the enclosure, and it's funny. After I moved, I had to. Here's Alex again. Had to deconstruct the enclosure and put it back together, and in the process, I found a bunch of little roly polies in the bedding that had just were just apparently on those logs, and I thought that was awesome. To me, that's like, hey, I didn't even try, and that it went well like that. So I think that's that can also happen. You can have an inadvertent bioactive, and I think that's pretty sick. So anyway, you're back.
Yep. Sorry, little Wi-Fi glitch.
We made it through the hiccup. Oh my god. So anyway, another topic in that same kind of realm that I know we had planned on talking about and we've had conversations about is the whole kind of nutrition side of things, and how there's a lot of misnomers and you know, information that is either telephoned down the line where it might be incorrect or partially correct or missing a little piece here or there. You know, so basically you can take this from a snake perspective, lizard perspective, however you want to. What are some things as far as animal nutrition that you've seen that either need to be highlighted more, corrected, or just have more of a discussion about?
So I'm going to tie this back. So again, I am not an animal nutrition scientist. Let me state that first and foremost. What I would like to say is I'd like to think I know a little bit, because I had to pass an entire test in a class I took on animal nutrition to justify fulfilling my minor degree in captive wildlife husbandry and techniques. So in a sense, all living things need a majority of three things: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, right? Your three building blocks.
The macro.
Yes. And so from there, then, in the case of animal husbandry, different species require different amounts of that. And then to dumb it down, I mean, you've got your fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K, water soluble vitamins like vitamin B, vitamin C, and then various amino acids which help perform different functions. Some of which, I'm not going to lie right now, are not coming to my brain because I memorized them like 3 years ago. So regardless,
Doing better than me.
Okay, so the point is that the animals need these in some extent, but at the same time, they can have too much of them. Too many lipids, fats, you get obese animals, right? Or even feeding too much, too many carbs, if I'm not mistaken, those turn into fats. That's why if you eat like a bunch of crackers, right? You know, something that's really high in carbohydrates, like you get overweight. It happens with people. It can happen with animals. Or proteins, I think. Maybe it's proteins, not carbs. Maybe it's both. That, unfortunately, I do not know.
Everything. At the end of the day, it's just, you know, it's that calorie balance, the energy balance of, you know, like fats are the most dense of the three. So if you're consuming a higher volume of fats relative to your carbs and your protein, it's easier to tip those scales because fats are so dense. I think that kind of gets to the conversation of people thinking like, oh, I don't want to feed a lot of rats because rats are higher in fat. It's like, okay, well, at what interval are you feeding rats compared to birds that are calorically lighter? You know, you can't compare apples to apples when it comes to those two prey items, because their physiology is so incredibly different that they have to be treated as what they are. It's just completely different things.
Precisely. And the other thing that I want to highlight with that is, like, an animal that is designed to eat something possesses the enzymes to break that food down. So let's say snakes. A lot of people talk about dietary variety snakes, which is great. But tying back to what we discussed earlier too, a lot of people have been keeping snakes on rodents for years. But it also depends on the type of snake. Pythons, for example, they have labial heat pits. They are rodent specialists. A lot of people that breed pythons feed only rodents. Process of elimination. Can you offer them a quail chick or something? Yeah, it's probably not going to hurt them. I think there was a study that came out a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, about how male ball pythons, they found nestling birds in them as they move from like mound to mound looking for females during the breeding season. So during that time of year, their diet shifts towards birds. But what unfortunately might happen is somebody will say, well, now I'm going to only feed birds because it's clearly leaner than mice, and that's why my snake is obese.
Right.
Well, did you factor in the size of your prey item? A larger feeder rodent, there's a point where, have you ever, I mean, yeah, you've worked with rodents, and I'd like to think so have I, that the idea that a medium rat is roughly the same body length as a extra large rat. What's the difference? The level of fat at that point. So maybe your, I don't know, boa constrictor, you just feed it a smaller meal more frequently instead of a large meal more frequently, and avoid maybe feeding the girth of the body. Or let's say you're food cycling something, you feed it a prey item the girth of the body when you want to get follicular development going, right? get the female to start yolking those follicles, process of vitellogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
So she needs fats, she needs protein. So you hammer her with a big ass meal. And then there's a lot of varanid people go through like what they do for food cycling. I was talking with a buddy of mine who currently actually has got a clutch of Dorianus eggs incubating, and he did the same thing. And this guy's bred Molinas. He's done the exact same thing. I was talking to a friend who's done tree monitors. I had an internship bred green trees. It was awesome. So the idea is that at the end of the day, I might not have offered the most dietary variety. And I try to, for the sake of enrichment, if you will, offer, say, my personal collection variety. But I won't lie, for a lot of my lizards, the majority of their protein sources do be roaches because it's a known insectivore. I know it has the bodily means of digesting cockroaches. So I just have to make sure I'm providing a healthy roach, which in that case, to meet my vitamin needs, I gut load with carrots for vitamin A. And the only reason I do that is because I personally had overdose experience with supplemental vitamin A. So I've just found it easier to offer vitamin A in trace amounts. But, if you're somebody who dusts your insectivores, bugs with retinol, in a preformed powder, by all means, keep doing it as long as you haven't had an overdose. That's just my personal thing. But that's what I mean by that is there's the needs of an animal provided in, I guess, a single food source. And it's how you're offering that single food source that's going to determine, I guess, how it's going to get the most out of it. I realize I worded that last bit poorly. But as you just highlighted with Mike, high metabolic rate animals will probably do better with birds and birds' eggs. Why? Because they have such a fast metabolism. So sure, this chick is lower in fat than a rodent, but maybe for something like a snake, which has a slower metabolic rate and doesn't eat as often, you want to use a rodent because you're going to get a lot of fat, which will last it a while between meals, good amount of protein, and a good amount of the carbs. Monitor lizards, maybe you feed mice instead of rats, smaller, right? But still protein, a little bit of fat. I always laugh sometimes when people say, birds are leaner. In calories, yes, but if I'm not mistaken, newborn chicks have got all that yolk. It's more fatty. So arguably they're more fattier, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that. Somebody knows, correct me in the comments. But regardless, it's the idea of that it's less calorie dense. So you're going to feed that more frequently because something with a high metabolic rate is going to want lower calories more frequently. Something with a slower metabolic rate is going to want a lot of calories infrequently. And it just comes down to the keeper to identify that, and there's so many other factors that influence metabolic rate because you got to remember we're working with ectothermic animals. So my water, right? Who would have thought, guys?
What?
Reptiles are cold-blooded. In case you needed a reminder, welcome back to 6th grade biology. Man just got up and left. So,
my God.
So for the case of the example, I'll use my water dragons. I food and light cycle and temperature cycle my water dragons to get them to breed. I feed them maybe once or twice a week in the winter because my ambient temperatures in that room are high 70s. But then the moment spring and summer hits and they're rocking 82 to 90, I am feeding them daily. Their metabolic rate is up because the temperature is higher. That's also their signal that more food is coming, and then more food comes, and then they cycle, and I get eggs. And then they get a break as it cools down. And that's something I've noticed with the captive sector is we don't always think about that. And, I think there's always that sort of, I guess, lack of communication that just because your animal is not breeding doesn't mean you have to consider all these other external factors. There are I honestly sometimes wonder if the reason a lot of animals become obese is because we're like, oh, it's not a breeder, so I'm just going to keep it on the same consistent feeding schedule. And then when its body is designed to not eat as much food, they're still feeding it at a same consistent rate, and then it gets fat. And so then we fall into that myth of, well, I'm just not going to feed it ever. And then they don't breed, and then they get stunted, but it's suddenly deemed correct because at least it's not fat, even though it's not at adult size after 10 years. So I know that's going to piss some people off. I feel so bad just listing these over and over, but it's something that has to be said and considered because even when, I wasn't breeding water dragons, I was raising up my first one as a pet. I just noticed she didn't eat as much in the winter, so I simply didn't feed her as much. She was fine.
I mean,
it's
that observation is incredible, because that kind of ties in a lot what we're talking about, is that kind of critical eye for what's going on in front of you. It's, I mean, you just noticed a trend in your animal, and you went with it because she seemed to have been going that direction, and you're like, well, let's maybe not try to force my will on this animal, which very clearly knows how to be itself better than I do. So why not move in that direction? And I think another thing to kind of couple with this topic is that I think variety of diet is definitely a hot button topic. I think a topic, though, that should be parallel to that, which I almost never hear discussed, is actual quality of that prey. Okay, you have quail from here, quail from there, rat from here, rat from there, dubia from here, dubia from there. Though that's not the same. A cheap old steak at Walmart and a steak in a 5-star restaurant, they're not the same steak. Produce aren't the same. Organic versus conventionally farmed versus grown in your backyard. Like, this applies to what we feed our animals as well. And I guess, I know you have lots to say about that. Let's get into this. What do you have to say about quality of prey?
That's why I breed my own feeders. I've been breeding dubia roaches since I started keeping lizards, because maybe to me it was common sense, but I said, I know what I'm putting into the bugs. I know the standard diet I give them. I know what vegetables I gut load with. I know the type of vegetables I'm buying. I get to hand pick my collard greens, hand pick them. And I look at the leaves. I'm like, yeah, this one looks fine. It's good. If it's good enough for the roaches, then it's certainly good enough for the lizards, because it'll be inside the gut of the roaches when the lizard eats the roach. And with all due respect, I like to make it to where, like, I would feel comfortable eating those collard greens. And sometimes I do. I just chop them up and put them in. Definitely not the roach.
So we got a super chat here, and I don't think I have the answer for this. Maybe you do, but correct protein source for a green iguana. This is a good question.
I mean, it'd be plant protein. That's a herbivorous species. So, it's plant proteins. Everything is going to have proteins in it, even so much as grass. Think about tortoises. Like,
Sure.
Oh, it's a vegetarian, low protein diet. Well, maybe low in what we consider proteins needed for us, that human bias. I see protein, I think meat. Texas Roadhouse steak. I could go for that right now. But in the case of the tortoise, it's the plant proteins that are important. In the case of a herbivore like an iguana, your dark leafy greens, collards, mustards, dandelions, high in calcium. That would be your ideal protein source. A lot of places that suggest feeding green iguanas like dog food for protein, don't do it. Because as I was saying earlier, the way certain animals process foods is going to be different. Sure, the protein in dog food might be a similar compound of a protein found in collard greens, but it's the fact that the protein, like the percentage of plant proteins, is arguably lower than the high density protein found in meat. That's what's going to cause your iguana to have gastrointestinal issues, if I'm not mistaken. Unfortunately, I'm not a reptile vet, so I could have totally fudged up that terminology. Regardless, plant proteins are what you're going to want for a herbivorous animal.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if this applies to iguanas, but I know from research in the past this applies to tortoises. You can definitely go too far with it, where, let's say a lot of tortoises are grazing species. They're going to be eating constantly. They're going to be eating all the time. So if they're eating very rich greens all the time, you're going to get overloaded with, you're going to get an overdose, or, a too high of a percentage of protein in that diet. Like sulcata tortoises, they're grazing on fairly basically dead grasses all the time. And those are very, very nutrient weak grasses, but that's what that animal is adapted to. this definitely doesn't help answer the question, but just something to keep in mind for anyone who keeps herbivorous reptiles. The boss is here. Well, I'm glad we were making you proud. I'm having a lot of fun. I think we've had a really good conversation so far. So
Definitely.
But yeah, I guess to kind of circle back to what we were talking about with with the quality of the diet. I think that is an interesting. We were saying about instead of using vitamin A supplementation, you are just feeding more carrots. That to me is interesting because obviously the whole point of a supplement is to add to the diet something that can't be obtained via like with humans. We take vitamin C or magnesium or whatever because we're not obtaining enough of that in our diet. But like what can be achieved by the way that you feed your feeders?
I'd like to think direct nutrient uptake. And part of that just comes into doing your research. So carrots are high in carotenoids.
Yes.
And I know it's got a lot of vitamin A. Same with sweet potato. Collard greens have got vitamin A in it too, and vitamin K. And vitamin K is a nutrient that animals don't need a ton of. So if you were to ask me, an insectivorous lizard like a water dragon that needs vitamin K, what is the more natural way of providing that? Dusting an entire bug in supplemental vitamin K, or just a trace amount of it in collard greens inside the gut of a roach more frequently. Like what you were saying with the sulcata. They need a ton of calories of low nutrient food. But if you start feeding them high nutrient foods, a lot of people say that's what causes pyramiding because the tortoise is literally growing too fast.
Ah, interesting.
So maybe in the case of the water dragon, you don't want to power feed your animal. There's also a difference between underfeeding, right? You don't want your water dragon to be 6 inches at a year old. Normally they're pushing around 18. And I don't power feed. Often I just leave bowls full of roaches and they eat at their leisure because they're going to know when they're hungry. They're often pretty good at it, at least in the case of Chinese water dragons. So the idea is that you're really going to want to bring emphasis to the idea of like, what are you putting into your feeder as opposed to what are you putting onto your feeder?
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think, I think probably a reason why this hasn't been emphasized in the hobby is that a lot of people, are selling feeders that aren't, they're being mass produced. There's not as much tact going into that process. And also with that said, not to bash on that because we need feeders. There's a lot of reptiles that need to eat in this country. A lot of pet stores that need to be supplied for their customers that come and buy every week. But this is just another way that any of us, anyone listening can take that take your husbandry to the next level, is by applying this kind of attention to what you're doing. We supplement, we use lighting that's supposed to improve the metabolizing of different compounds and whatnot. Okay, but how is that D3 being absorbed to begin with? You're not getting it. You're metabolizing it through what you eat, and then the process of that absorption could be increased by the lighting and whatnot. But to me, the source of that to begin with is crucially important to the long-term health of that animal. So
Well said, man. Yeah. I especially like you're saying with the D3, there are a lot with especially a lot of the lizards I keep, Hydrosaurus most notably in this case. In the wild, their eyes are blue. I don't know if you can see it on the little thing up here.
I
got
can
like a blue.
Real
So
close.
in the case of Salalefins, their eyes almost never turn blue indoors. So there's something to be said about, yeah.
Sorry.
So But so the point there is that maybe they're just getting by as far as their D3 needs, but they're still developing differently in the wild in that case. And again, most notably, Scott has said, no matter what lights we use, it's no match for the sun. And because of that, I still supplement with D3. There
Sure.
seems to be like this whole movement of people keeping lists like no D3 if you use UV lighting. I use a little bit of it, like once a week, which is more than what most people say or suggest. But one thing I've noticed is my lizards don't have underbites. They grow at steady rates.
Mm.
And often to not, they look more, I guess, proportional in size. There's no like big eyes and short noses, which I see a lot of lizards look like when they're kept only with calcium and UV lighting.
Interesting.
Maybe it's just my methodology, but I noticed that a lot. There seems to be a big turn away from supplemental D3. And there's no denying that you can overdose on it. Personally, I haven't found any literature on overdose of supplemental D3. I haven't. In fact, I was reading a paper where they were keeping iguanas with UV lighting and they were supplementing on the salads vitamin D3 levels that were roughly equal to almost 200,000 international units per kilogram. If it's any comparison, I use Repashy's high D3 once a week, and that is 50,000 international units per kilogram. So you're talking something as UV sensitive as an iguana with 4 times as much supplemental D3 on salads. So there's much more surface area for that powder to collect versus a bug.
Sure.
I only supplement my bugs when I have to. I don't even put powder on my greens because I just select dandelions and collards for the most part that are naturally higher in calcium because that's what's in the green, not on it. And it's worked so far. But again, I'm not going to claim to be the expert on it because I didn't get my degree in animal nutrition.
But the anecdotal accounts are very important. And actually, that was when you were saying that about the disproportionate growth. I've 100% seen that with my scrub pythons in either direction. I have some animals that I acquired that were, in my opinion, pretty well underfed, and they had skinny bodies. Clearly, but they had very large heads proportionate to the rest of their body. They their tails were kind of sunken in. The snake had grown because it was aging, but it grew in a way where it looks like a snake that was wild caught and just landed off of an import, where that animal's been deprived of all of its natural processes for so long. On the other side, I've seen with scrub pythons and with other species, animals that were, for lack of a better term, power fed, and they have very large bodies, much thicker than they should, obviously, but they have small heads, proportionate. And I have 2 females in my collection now that I acquired that for a period of time were fed really heavily, and they're small adults now, but they still have that weird proportion of head to body. And I think that ties in well to kind of what we were talking about earlier of, what the conversation not being overfeeding versus underfeeding, of appropriate feeding and cyclical feeding, and, working with these animals' natural processes to be like, okay, it's wintertime, I'm going to cut back, because in the wild, it's going to be drier during this period. Food will be less available. It might not be getting colder necessarily in some of these tropical climates by a significant amount, but there's some environmental variables that are changing that decrease the availability of food. Yada, yada, yada. So I don't know if there's a question there, but I think there's did you have anything to add to those thoughts, Sir Alex?
Your guess is as good as mine right now. I just try and follow what I see the lizards do, man. Just as you try and follow what you see the snakes do. And then we share those findings with other people who keep what we like. And then we try and get to the next question. Right now, the question we're asking, which we don't have an answer to, is how do we do it right by the animal, which is a question everybody should be asking. But everybody seems to be focused more on saying they have the answer and not admitting they don't know the answer.
Yeah, and you may have an answer, and that answer might be more evolved in a couple of years. You might not be completely wrong, but you might not have been completely right.
Precisely.
And that's why I love having these conversations, because I think, you know, I right there, an observation that you had made on lizards, I applied to something that I had seen on snakes, and I
There's a commonality.
I hadn't even considered that it could have been also like a micronutrient difference either with calcium levels or whatever, because, you know, a snake can be underfed on rodents or underfed on birds, and that animal probably looks really different 3 years, you know, if you do a focus group of both methods. But yeah, no, I love these conversations, and I just hope that we can kind of spark people to kind of start questioning these things as well, start applying some of these practices to your animals, because I think this is just how we move all this forward. You know, if we don't ask those questions that, you know, go against the status quo or to go against the marketing of big company ABC, then we stay stagnant.
And often you'll find that there are people in the past that went against the status quo, and those were some of the most successful people in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'll just Bert Langerwerf, like we were talking about, quality control of the feeders. Agama International, that man produced thousands of Australian water dragons, kept them outside. He only fed them superworms and roaches, no dietary variety. He had lizards breeding into their teens.
Yeah.
He gut loaded all of his bugs. He didn't dust anything. He kept them outdoors, so they got all like natural sun in D3.
Yeah.
There's photos of his facility with snow, and those lizards still woke up the following spring and did their thing.
Yeah.
When everybody was preaching Vitalites, which we now know emitted no usable UV. And maybe we'll find 20 years from now that the ZoomEd ReptiSun 10.0s I'm using are trash. But until then, I'm just going to use what I got and keep going from there. Radiant heat panels, heat tape, PVC, it could all become obsolete. Maybe we'll go back to using fish tanks because we'll suddenly think it's superior. I don't know. But at least it's there for us to take notes of. But you're not going to see me saying that the new way is the right way and the way we're going to stay. Because like you said, I don't want to stagnate with the crowd.
No. And even if, you know, you don't make major changes, just thinking about it that way to begin with, I feel like is an important beginning to that process of just, you know, stretching your mind out, doing some mental exercises. You know, we only know so much, and I think a lot of times too, I think newer people can offer so much to these conversations because they haven't learned all the bad habits of people who've been keeping for decades, you know, or you know, as long as we have. A new perspective can change everything. So you know, that's why I think that these types of conversations are so important. And then, you know, I bet we have many to come going forward. I want to switch back to a topic we were talking about earlier, because I want to hear, you know, your explanation of it, and I think it's very interesting, especially for anyone who's followed your work or is now familiarized with it. Let's go through the sailfin dragon complex a little bit. I know we kind of talked about a few of the different species earlier, but you know, lay it out for us. What's the, you know, what's the taxonomy looking like? Where are these animals coming from? Yada yada yada.
All right. Before I begin, let me clarify again. I did not get my degree in sailfin dragons.
Yes, he did. Sailfin University.
iNatural. SU.
You've done it.
But all of my knowledge and time, I have to give thanks primarily to Scott Korner and Casey Schultz and Ryan Trammell, as well as some of my own independent research and just knowing how to use Google Scholar and search. The sailfins are interesting because for whatever reason, they're getting the spotlight now for the past couple of years. And I honestly think social media is to blame because people have been keeping them for a long time.
For sure.
There's just not a ton of people that are consistent with breeding them. I always see them as sort of like the one-off pet somebody maybe had or a zoo had, like a Russian legless lizard. I think Bert Langerwerf, not to reference him again, I know he bred them a couple times.
Okay.
But I don't know if anybody's bred them since. So sailfins have sort of been like that. And then all of that changed in 2020 when the previous three species, which were Hydrosaurus weberi, Hydrosaurus ambonensis, and Hydrosaurus pustullatus, were split into the 5 species. And the 2 new species were recognized solely from a paper that was published in 2014, Saale et al. And what they did is they broke down all of the genetics of the Philippine sailfin based on the different islands. And in those findings, they also wanted to compare those genetics to the genetic data they had from Hydrosaurus weberi and Hydrosaurus ambonensis. So here's what happened. They surveyed ambonensis, and when they went to the Sulawesi populations, they looked at the lizard you see behind me and are like, that is not a 2.5-foot green reticulated lizard. That is a 4-foot black and gold lizard, and it is not genetically the same. So they did some digging, and they realized Peters in 1872 described Hydrosaurus celebensis coming from the Celebes, which is now Sulawesi. You dig further back, and you'd see Bleecker in 1860 described Hydrosaurus microlophus back at the time as Istaturus microlophus. So there was already some old literature that referenced that the species on Sulawesi, or at least the sailfins on Sulawesi, were morphologically different. When I say morphologically, that's just a fancy word for saying what they look like, what their morphology is, because I know I sometimes throw big words. I do apologize to everybody listening. It's a force of habit.
Do not apologize.
Okay. So in summary, there are 5 species. Hydrosaurus ambonensis, which is the type species for the genus. Type species just means it represents the genus as a whole. So Hydrosaurus is represented by Hydrosaurus ambonensis, which is ironic because like out of all the 5 sailfins, it's like, in my opinion, the most different. So if they were ever to split it, that would probably stick as Hydrosaurus, and they would probably redescribe the other 4 species under the genus Lophura or Istaturus or whatever, because it's built more like a water dragon, although I guess from where it is geographically, arguably built more like a Hypsilaurus. Because Hypsilaurus papuanensis looks almost identical to a sailfin, but it's not. And so that species is found on Ambon and Surin as of now. Taxonomically, they are found in Papua New Guinea, but there are photos from sailfins in Raja Ampat, which is near Sorong, and those animals morphologically look like Hydrosaurus weberi. All the images I've seen that Ari Flagel has sent me from that area, and there's a Facebook group called Herping the Globe on Facebook. Somebody posted photos of sailfins from Raja Ampat. They look like weberi.
Interesting.
So I'm pretty sure that's what it has to be. But who knows? Honestly, that's so far from Halmahera and Ternate where weberi are. That could be a 6th species, which my professor back at university, he was a taxonomist. He was a pit viper taxonomist. He said that more than likely there is a different sailfin species on each island that hasn't been that has been sampled. So there's probably like a new species on Obor and like all those little islands in between where the known ones are found. There's probably new species. They just haven't been discovered yet. So if I ever decide to go to grad school, that's definitely a thesis work I've considered, but
yeah,
I'll see how that goes. So that's Ambonensis. As I said, Hydrosaurus weberi, which was technically the last species to be described. That one was described by Barbour in 1911, and that species comes from Halmahera and Ternate. Probably at the time, a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, the most common sailfin, those were labeled as integrades because they weren't full species. And what was coming in as H. weberi is what we now know as H. ambonensis. So there was a whole shuffle of the Latin. And I think it was mostly confusion on the hobbyist part because I was referencing older literature. And I actually found in the volume of the reptiles and amphibians of the Indonesian archipelago by Neil DeRouge, there's a reference that says Weberi occurs on Halmahera. So that's what I'd have to guess. Mike Stefani asked if there are any sailfins on the Togian Islands. Probably. I know when you go up into Gorontalo, which is the northernmost part, like that northernmost regency of Sulawesi, right before you get to the Togians, you do have Hydrosaurus there. I believe right now, taxonomically, that would be Hydrosaurus celebensis. And there is actually a photo of Varanus togianus, which I believe is what Mike has, but I know they go into Sulawesi. And there's a photo of Togianus basking on the same stream about 30 feet from a celebensis sailfin.
Really?
And I have an interesting theory that if I have time, I'll come back to that. But anyway, so you go, so you go from Amboinensis to Weberi, Ambon, Halmahera. You go to Sulawesi, and Sulawesi is the only known island right now where there are 2 species of sailfin endemic. And the word endemic means that they occur nowhere else. So they're only found on Sulawesi, previously referred to as the Celebes. And that is Hydrosaurus microlophus and Hydrosaurus celebensis, which I just mentioned earlier. Celebensis is restricted to the central and north part of right now. Hydrosaurus microlophus, though, only occurs on the southern peninsula. So that's referred to as Sulawesi Selatan, or South Sulawesi. That's what it translates to. Supposedly, there are 2 main phenotypes of Hydrosaurus microlophus. I would be willing to argue it's probably a subspecies because you literally have one that is a gold and gray lizard, and you have another one that is almost like a burnt brown and black. But they come in under the same name, Microlophus, but I have a couple friends in the States who have both phenotypes, and even the babies look different. These southern phenotype babies, I tried forever to find what they looked like. And a friend of mine bought some of them and they're green. They look like Webers when they're babies and then they just turn black. Yeah. Whereas the Microlophus that was described in Denzer et al. From the 2020 paper that resurrected the taxonomy, that Microlophus does come in, and that one's pretty easy to ID just because of the huge scale clusters. This southern phenotype, that's what I call it. And the reason why I refer to it as a phenotype is because I personally have not been to Sulawesi and can say that I know what locality it's from. So you'll see on Indonesian forums, they'll be like, oh yeah, Solear Malino. Solear is just what the locals call them. But they'll say, oh, Solear Malino, like, oh, it comes from Malino. I don't know that. I haven't been to Malino.
Sure.
For all I know, they went to a market in Malino, and that's what they bought it. And the vendor was like, yeah, I caught it around here. And the vendor could totally be lying because he doesn't want to give away his hunting locations. So whenever I see this dark lizard, I refer to it as, okay, if it's from Sulawesi, it's from most likely the southernmost area, southern phenotype. And I know from the findings in the paper that was published in 2020 that this true Microlophus, or what I choose to call the northern phenotype, occurs in the northernmost regions of that South Peninsula, near Pinrang and Sopang regencies. But if I were to ever breed Microlophus and sell them, I'm not going to label them as locality specific because I did not go out and collect them. They will simply be northern phenotype Hydrosaurus Microlophus. Anybody that's labeling their sailfins with like locality specifics, it's just marketing because I have no idea where those were collected. And that's the important. I'm not trying to sound mean or entitled saying that, but did you go to Sulawesi and hand collect your sailfin? Unlikely. So that's why I'm also super religious about counting those scales, because anybody could go to a show and pick up a Indo-giant baby, and it's more than likely mislabeled. I've actually seen this because, and part of me wonders if this is due to the pet trade in Indonesia. There are most likely integration zones. There are animals coming in that look.
As soon as you stop.
Huh?
That was going to be my next question as soon as you took a breath.
Yeah. Oof, I've long-winded rant there.
Please keep. Awesome.
But yeah, so that's like weird because you get sailfins that come in from Sulawesi and they develop with traits of both. They're arguably a natural hybrid, or maybe just an animal that represents an integrate. We have a local example I can think of is in Illinois. You go down to the Snake Road area, the speckled king snake and the black king snake, not the Mexican black king snake, but the true, like the Eastern black king snake, Lampropeltis niger, not Lampropeltis negrita. And so Holbrooki and Niger overlap. And so you have really dark speckled kings. Two different species, but that area where they overlap, it's noticeably different. And so I'm wondering if it's the same phenomenon with sailfins there. The locals there will refer to them as like Solear Banteon, Solear Moros. But again, I wasn't there and I didn't collect the dang lizard. So I'm just going to label it as most likely an integrade sailfin. But again, you know, I'm not the expert on that. So I'm not going to go around policing saying yours is from that regency because I don't know. But what I can tell you is that based on the findings of Denzer et al. 2020 and literal documented scale counts, tail counts, morphological traits from specimens in jars that represent the holotypes, I have a rough idea what I'm looking at. And that's why when you see me standing at an expo, all quiet with a pen in my hand, counting the scales, that's what I'm doing. So those are the two species from Sulawesi, Hydrosaurus microlophus, Hydrosaurus celebensis, likely more subspecies on Sulawesi. Lastly, try not to pick favorites, but this is probably my favorite. And somebody asked this in the comment, or the comments, or the live chat. Hydrosaurus pustellatus, described by Eschultz in 1829, the purple violet colored sailfin. I remember when Casey Schultz actually wrote the section on pustellatus in the article we co-authored. She titled that subsection "A Passion for Purple" because Hydrosaurus pustellatus is arguably the most coveted of the 5 sailfins in the United States pet trade because you can't get them imported. Philippines closed down in 1994, as I said earlier. And quite literally, I mean, how do you not just say wow when you look at a freaking purple and blue lizard? Let's be real here. They are beautiful. And unfortunately, as I stated earlier, I don't think there's enough people taking the lineages seriously to where you know if there are pure ones out there. What I will say is I am working with Pure Philippines right now. I do have some pure bloodlines that I can trace back from Scott stock and another one that was produced overseas that's an F1. But that's all I'm going to say for now because I want to breed these first before I start walking around. There are too many people that just keep them and they suddenly think they're an expert. You know, I kept water dragons for 5 years and then I bred them, and now people take me a little bit seriously with water dragons. And while I know sailfin taxonomy, you know, I've been keeping these lizards for like just over a year. So in the grand scheme of things, that's nothing. But that's why I'm learning with people like Casey, like Scott Corning, to really knock it out of the park, hopefully. Yeah. I said, talk is cheap. I can talk to you about sailfin taxonomy because I'm just repeating the successes of people that studied them. That's really not that special. If anything, people like, oh, Alex knows a lot about sailfins, but I did not do that. I'm just repeating what I learned from other successful people. But maybe one day I'll get to be successful and actually breed these things. I'm pretty sure one of them's cycling infertile eggs this time of year, which would match with the cycle of her mother, because I've got data on all that, which is kind of cool. But until I get to that point, that's all I'm going to say. So those are the 5 species of sailfins. That's Hydrosaurus 101 with Professor Alex Myers right there. And I would highly recommend sailfins as a great species to the advanced keeper.
Is there a sailfin in particular that would be the best introduction, you think?
They're all 5 pretty much the same, except for Philippines and Amboinensis, in my opinion. And this is the theory, actually, that I'll tie back to. So Scott Corning always told me that he never had issues acclimating Hydrosaurus celebensis, the Sulawesi, the black and gold species, Hydrosaurus microlophus, and Hydrosaurus weberi. He said weberi were great at the time. They called them integrades. He said the babies would eat right in front of you. Whereas pustellatus and Amboinensis are crazy. Even my pustellatus, which are captive bred, are psychos. So here's my theory on this. I don't even want to say theory because I really don't have a ton of evidence to back it up. But here's my hypothesis. So as I highlighted earlier with Mike Stefani's question, Sulawesi sailfins were basking on the same river as Varanus togayanus and the subspecies Varanus salvator celebensis. Smaller water monitors. Sailfin lizards on Sulawesi get 3.5 feet. So do the monitors. You go to the Philippines, and now you're dabbling with Varanus kumingai, Varanus samarensis, if I'm not mistaken, and Varanus nicalis. Yeah. 5-foot apex predatory varanids. And those sailfins are so much flightier because I guarantee you, even a subadult sailfin is going to get freaking whacked by an adult, water monitor like that. Ambon Island, Varanus obor, right? Without a doubt, you've probably got a member of the Dorianis complex there. And while it could be argued that Halmahera has Varanus yuanawai, the tricolor monitor, and Varanus ceruvilans, the turquoise monitor, the habitat preferences of those varanids is not as riparian focused as the water monitor species, which is where the sailfins live. But obor is much more like Melinus, which we know is a little bit more aquatic. So, and we also know Amboinensis is naturally smaller. So then you could argue, okay, a 3.5, 4-foot Melinus would probably take down a 2.5-foot adult Amboinensis. Whereas the habitat preferences of the tricolor monitor and the turquoise monitor do not really overlap with Hydrosaurus weberi.
Yeah.
And isn't it just coincidence that where the monitor lizards either don't share the habitat with the sailfins, or the monitor lizards are the same size of the sailfins, the natural temperaments of those sailfins coming in wild caught from people who have kept those sailfins for decades have noted that they're pretty chill.
I think you're onto something.
That was a ton of information, but it's just a thought.
It makes sense. It makes sense. I feel like there's a similar kind of theory about Biak green tree pythons. That they're in a harsher area with more predation, yada yada. That's why they're more aggressive. Biak scrub pythons, on the other hand, are very secretive, kind of proportionately the opposite of the green trees, which maybe their micro habitat is different where they're not faced with those same predators the green trees are. I don't know, but I think it's a very interesting observation, and I wouldn't be shocked if that is the truth as to why they act differently. It makes perfect sense.
Like I said, just a thought, a hypothesis, but until I go to Halmahera and sit in a tree for 12 hours watching to see how weberi behave, and then I do the same thing with all the other 5 species, it's just a guess.
Yeah. And that's, the unfortunate truth is we are working with a very, very high volume of guesswork being herpetoculturists in a country in which our animals do not live endemically. So
it's unfortunate.
It is what it is. We're working with our limited information, but couple that limited information with our hands-on experience, and we can get somewhere for sure. To a point of understanding that would be elevated by that wild experience, but we can also get to the point where when that opportunity arises, the knowledge base is already significant enough where you know what you're going there to look for. So yeah, I think that it's very interesting and a very, very great description of the genus. I think it'll be cool to have this conversation again in 5 or 10 years and see how different it is. Might
be more species. Hopefully I'll have bred all of them. We'll see.
Hopefully. Yeah. But before we kind of start to wind into the tail end of the episode, which we've been here for a while, and I don't want to keep you from sleeping. I know you're a busy man. Talk about your water dragons a bit. At this point, as far as your breeding goes, it's obviously what you're best known for. I guess tell us all what you'd like us to know about your water dragons?
They're great lizards. The one con is they don't understand clear barriers. So all of my setups, I just have paper taped across the front, which really makes them terrible for display enclosures. Same thing applies with sailfins. But in the case of the water dragon specifically, the one thing I've noticed, every zoo that I've seen with water dragons, their faces are just bashed in.
Yeah,
it's really unfortunate. But unlike the sailfins, they're much calmer. They stay smaller. The Chinese water dragons are, I like to say Asian water dragon, because they're really only found in a small part of China. They're mostly found in Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. And they only get like 2.5 feet. You might get a big male. You know, the biggest one I've personally seen was 37 inches. But you also have to factor in that their tail is about 75% of their body length.
Right.
So the snout to vent on that specific specimen was like maybe 8 inches. And even then, it's another. Yeah, they're not very big. But I'd also argue too that might have just been a really old animal. You know, one thing I've noticed is one of my main female water dragon that I've had forever. She's very likely almost 11 years old. I've had her 10 years now. So she'll be coming up on 11 years in my care this September. But I got her when she was a foot long, and she stayed about 2 feet until by the time she was like 5 years, and she's just slowly grown. And now she's pushing 30 inches.
Okay.
Well, sometimes I wonder if it's sort of that idea of growing fast, but stay at a body size where you can healthily lay eggs, but then grow slowly. So when you see these big adult males that are huge and impressive, you got to wonder how old are some of those lizards? Because I know captive bred one. My buddy said he once got a captive bred one to 31 inches in a year. And then it just stayed around like 32, 34. And I wouldn't be surprised then if you kept that thing for 15 years, if it would have grown to be 37 inches. I would love to test it out one day. I'm currently raising up a new young male. But, you know, until I've kept it for 15 years, who am I to say? So as of right now, they're a pretty reasonably sized lizard. They do need bigger enclosures than what most people realize. You know, all my cages are 4 to 6 feet long, 2 to 4 feet deep, 4 to 6 feet high. That's just what I aim for. If you've got more lizards, go on the larger size of those dimensions. If you've got a single pet, go on the smaller side. But make sure it's within those dimensions. And with all of the lizards that I've talked about, including the sailfin, bigger is always better. But let me bring emphasis that as long as you can keep it hot enough. Ambient air temperature is something people don't discuss often with these lizards. And that's because lately I've noticed there's a trend in herpeticulture on a focus with microclimates. The one thing that I want to remind folks, though, is that water dragons specifically, this is what I also noticed with the basilis, is that they sit out in the sun with high intense UV, but they only do that for a couple hours to bask or to UV regulate. And then they go sit in the shade.
Okay, yeah.
Even when you're in the shade, the air is still 85, 90, but you're just not sitting under the direct sun.
Sure.
So what unfortunately happens is you'll have, and again, this is just a novice mistake. I'm guilty of it, where you'll have a fish tank set up. Say they're raising a baby water dragon in like an Exoterra, and it's in their living room. So your ambient house temperature, say in the Midwest, just because that's what I'm familiar with, is 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have a basking spot that's 95, 115. Perfect. You've got your 10.0 UVB. Lizard basks, cooks itself, but then it goes to the shade. And now it's suddenly going from 115 to 72 ambient air temp. Now it's metabolic rate tanks. That lizard gets sick, and it unfortunately dies. And I honestly think that's why a lot of people have killed them by the masses when they came in as wild caughts back in the day.
That makes sense.
And I feel like the monitor people were already ahead of this. John Adragna, I don't know if you follow him on Facebook. Did you see he posted a photo from like 1989? He had a sulfur water monitor in this wooden box. And he's like, yeah, the light inside was definitely a fire hazard, but I knew screen tops were not the way to go with monitors.
No, I got to go try to dig that picture up. I don't think I've seen that. That's pretty cool.
So, because it's the idea of trapping in that bubble of warm air. Now, not so much heat that you're going to heat exhaust your animal, but for the most part, if your room is in the mid 70s, there's really no excuse, I should say, to keep a water dragon with a screen top enclosure, especially with how convenient it is to go to a reptile show and buy a basic 3x2 PVC cage. Throw a baby water dragon in that, raise it up for the first year and a half. By the time it's 18 inches long, hopefully you'll have built a nice enclosure. It's really, I don't see the excuse for it unless it's money, which at the time was definitely a hard thing to compete with. I'll transition here because water dragons were dirt cheap.
Sure.
I mean, I remember going to a wholesaler, just working at the previous exotic pet shop I was at. I could have bought baby water dragons for like $5 a head.
Yeah.
And yet it's a lizard that costs a few $100s to set up properly. And now they're not coming in wild caught anymore. As of I want to say it was April. I follow CITES on YouTube, which is, for anybody who's not familiar, CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. One heck of an acronym. So what this organization does is they assess various species of flora and fauna and how they're used by humans. This can be everything from, like the domestic pig and how it's shipped overseas for, farming and agriculture. And it can be reptiles for the sake of the exotic pet trade. And so Chinese water dragons have literally been collected in huge masses for decades. There was a paper that came out in 2019, or no, maybe it was 2020. I think it was Gweiss et al. Is the author. And I think they did the math that just within the past 10 years, I think it was like 2009 to 2019, like 75,000 water dragons were exported globally.
Whew. Damn.
And that was just to Europe.
For a second. Where'd they go?
You see a lot of beardies and crested geckos and leopard geckos, but so where are all the water dragons? And that's what I was saying about cheap price tag, unfortunate case of care. And no fault to the customer. They usually it's impulsive. Everybody gets a little impulsive when they're at a reptile show.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's just unfortunate that, again, in this case, that's why we have these podcasts, so we can talk about this and hopefully educate somebody. I guarantee you the reason water dragons were not breeding was going back to the start. They find an old website. They try and keep the water dragons like that, even if they're a successful reptile breeder. Maybe you go from snakes and you want to have your new cheap breeding project of water dragons. So you find your first website and you kill all your water dragons in 6 months, and now you're discouraged from ever working with them. And that happens for 30 years. Nobody appreciates them except for a handful of people. And then a nerd like me also appreciates them, starts learning, and literally it's scary to think. Like, I remember having conversations over dinner with Ryan Shermell. He's like, dude, one day they're just going to stop coming in. Like, we're constantly fighting with the import market. He's like, dude, one day it's going to happen. It'll probably happen within our lifetime. I remember him saying that with a boneless chicken wing in his mouth. And sure as hell, it happened last year. So now that they're not coming in, I mean, myself, I can think of 2 other people who are consistently breeding water dragons. Chinese water dragons in the U.S. There are more Australian water dragons for sale right now than there are Chinese. Who would have thought that day would have ever come? That's all to the pet trade, yeah.
That's a crazy statistic, and I think it's a statistic that would be cool. I mean, I don't know if cool is the word, but I think good to know for a lot of stuff to really put everything in perspective. Like, and obviously we can only do so much about it, because if the US isn't taking these animals, they're going to Japan, they're going to South Korea, they're going somewhere. But if we can do our part, my God, should we do our part? I'm
terrified right now. Like, I thought the lineage game was awful for Philippine sailfins, but at least there's 3 decades of records I can track. And I have had to come to the realization that my wild caught animals and the wild caught animals of the 2 other people I know likely could become the only future breeding stock in the United States.
It's crazy to think about that, but you might be right.
I'm horrified. Have you seen how messed up bearded dragons look from inbreeding? Now, granted, there were a handful of individuals that came in initially, but at least we were able to get them imported from Europe.
Yeah.
I was messaging a sailfin guy in Wales, and he said, yeah, there's like nobody breeding them here. It is easier to get new bearded dragon bloodlines from Europe than it is Chinese water dragon. That terrifies me.
That's so weird. That's so weird.
I'm honestly like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm so scared thinking about it right now. And I feel like it also shows that you really don't know or appreciate what you have until it's gone. You know, I was graduated school. I would have had a few more years to build up some more wild caught blood to set myself up, similar to what you've done with scrub pythons. But I'm literally looking at myself, looking at potential outcrossings while journaling, and I'm thinking I can't even go 3 generations before I have to do a sibling or half sibling. And that's with my current breeding group of 5 animals. And that also counts my friends group of like 6, because a lot of their stuff is like siblings.
So that's within the 3 collections, yours included. You can only go 3.
Oh, I'd say with their collections, maybe we could push 10, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I have
sure
a lot of math that I have to do.
But considering that, and obviously of those 75,000, they're not all unrelated, but certainly more than 6 to 10 bloodlines. And I think, for anyone who's listening, if there's something that you care about, a species that you are interested in that are being overlooked because they're commonly imported or whatever, you don't want to feel that regret of that day coming of the CITES listing, the ESA listing, or whatever it may be, and then you're like, oh no, if I had just thought ahead a little better, this project that I care about would be set up for the future. But now I've waited, and now the opportunity's gone. So we don't, people like myself and like Alex, we want to see more diversity in the hobby. We want to see, we want to get to the point where we can be at reptile shows in 15, 20 years, and one species isn't represented more than 15% at that show, get on it. If there's that thing that you're interested in, make sure you can house them properly. But once you're there, don't wait on it, because these, we don't have control over that part of it, and we won't. So get it while you can, because once you can't, too bad, But with that said, at least you do have as many Chinese water dragons, Asian water dragons, as you like to call them, available as you do. It's not perfect, but surely it's better than what it could be.
Trying, man. I'm trying.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're probably going to wind things down. We've been at it for quite a while here. I think there's going to be some obvious answers to this question, but maybe some not so obvious answers. How do you foresee you growing your collection, your work within private herpetoculture? What do you see as your future with that?
I'm not gonna lie. I could never bring myself to breed reptiles full time to pay my bills. I've always been a 9 to 5 person, and then make reptiles my 5 to 9.
Sure.
Yeah, it's 12 hours, but you know what? If you love what you do, yeah, okay. I know the saying, you love what you do, you never work a day in your life, is not always true, because there's gonna be some days where work is it's tough. But
for sure,
I would rather have, like, say, a rough day at work and then come home and be surrounded by animals that I love, versus doing nothing but caring for sailfins for 8 hours and water dragons, right? So the dream goal is to be able to have a sizable collection that I can still do without feeling burnt out, but to where it's also at the point where if I have a lizard for 6 months because it doesn't sell, it doesn't affect me in the slightest.
Yeah, that's a good way to be.
Yeah, That's what I want to do. Ideally, all 5 species of sailfins. Unfortunately, just with how life is working, like I finally moved into my own place. It's just an apartment, though. You know, if I want to do that many sailfins, thank you. I need a house, so that's part of the 5-year plan. Probably won't be expanding the sailfin variety. I think I'm just going to focus on pustullatus, build up a small group that I can accommodate appropriately, and all 5 different bloodlines, as well as this group of water dragons. Do that for a few years. Like I said, I'd rather stay consistent than having a bunch of animals and not doing it.
Yeah.
And
it's
after that, maybe expand, right?
What does that look like?
That'll be the house, the house with sailfins.
Yep. Is there any non-sailfin reptile you foresee in your future, or are you really, you want to make this happen as well as you can with as much of your effort as possible?
Honestly, what I found is through my choices with work, and I mean, this applies to everywhere I've worked. If there's something that's not really a lizard that I'm interested, I find a way to work with it.
Fair enough.
Crossed blue beauties off at an internship. I crossed Petius carinata. I crossed heck, there was a time when I was working with the Philippine sailfins before I kept them. Our Dominican red mountain boas are another great example. I love Chelobotheris. The whole genus is super cool.
Yeah.
But I'd rather, keep what I'm really passionate about and just find a way to enjoy working with all the other ones I want to do.
Yeah,
that's the best way I can say it.
Perspective to have, man. That's definitely, it's an admirable one. And I think that's the way of the future within the industry, especially with markets being flooded, so to speak. Finding a lane like that, being a small scale operation where your overhead is low, but you're producing high quality animals that you can conjure up a high demand for. Therefore, you can sell those animals for more per individual. Your profit margin increases. Obviously, it's not all about money, but at a certain point, you got to consider it because everything that we do costs money. And then with that model, selling those animals shouldn't be too hard. And the economy will rise and fall. But through what people have said was the crash of the reptile market, there were some markets that thrived. That to me points more towards the market than the economy. So I think it's time that we kind of explore a different route of how this is done on a professional scale, and I think that the future with it will be pretty cool. I guess another wrap-up question, and I think this will be a pretty easy one for you. But what's one or a couple dream herping trips that you have in your mind?
Probably, honestly, hopefully one of these dreams will be a reality. I am hoping I can go to Sulawesi next year, see the sailfins in the wild, spend like 8 days there.
Okay.
And I'd want to say for the second one, Philippines or Southeast Asia. I have a friend of my uncle's, family friend, who lives in Laos. When I showed him a photo of my water dragons, he's like, "Oh, you have Genga," which is apparently what they call those down there. So that was kind of cool. And maybe I can just visit him and then go see some wild Asian water dragons. But
yeah,
it's just one of those things where trip around the world isn't cheap. Lodging adds up. And if I'm going to do it, I want to do it right. Do it responsibly. So day by day. Yep.
Day by day indeed. Well, thank you for being here tonight. This went exactly as I would have liked it to. This was perfect. Definitely a perfect first episode for this segment going forward, and I think a really good, thought-provoking conversation. So I'm gonna put you backstage for now and close this out. But thank you, Alex. Thank you very much for here tonight.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody that tuned into the first episode of Kush's Corner.
All right, I'll see you in a second here. All right, well, that's the episode, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody who watched live. I was honestly shocked in a very good way of how many people tuned in, considering that this is the first of this kind on the channel here. And, you know, you didn't know what you were getting yourselves into. We may not have either. But I'm very happy to be doing this. I think we're going to have some really, really good thought-provoking conversations on this segment. And, you know, a lot of times there will be guests that are crossovers. You know, the MJ is interviewed as well. And I think it'll be interesting to kind of get different perspectives, different parts of their story. I think it'll be a good way to kind of round out some things and, you know, explore topics from different angles. So, but with that said, I'd like to say goodnight to everybody, and thank you everyone again for your support, and we will see you here again next week. Good night.